I'll convene the meeting and call it to order. Colleagues, just a couple of housekeeping notes before we begin. This meeting is in public and it is televised, number one. Secondly, we have, as you can see from our witnesses assembled at the table, a number of department officials who will be with us today, and because of the sheer size of the number of witnesses we have, we will be foregoing our usual opening statements and going into questions immediately to give all of you more time to ask questions of the officials before you. Treasury Board and their officials will be with us for the full 2 hours, and we will have 1-hour panels initially, followed by a second panel starting at approximately 12 noon. Today we have representatives in our first panel, besides the Treasury Board, from the Department of Finance, Department of Industry, Natural Resources, Transport, and the National Research Council of Canada. And with that brief introduction, we will now begin with our 7-minute round of questions. And Madame Ratanzi, the floor is yours.
Thank you all for being here. And we, as you know, Treasury Board has been back here a few times, are seized with the issue of Vote 40 and the allocation in Vote 40. And I understand that there has been a small confusion or misunderstanding, or perhaps lack of understanding, of what that Vote 40 is. And it has come before OGO, and OGO is the committee that has to approve the allocation. And there have been questions about how departments that have that money allocated to them are not comfortable or don't know what that money is for. And that's the narrative we've been hearing from the opposition. And so I want a global view of what this Vote 40 does and doesn't do. For example, I know that this has been a transition from the old system to the new system. In the old system, everybody approved without knowing what they were approving. They approved the main estimates. Now there's an alignment process. And as an accountant, I think that is where the alignment process allows us to have a contingency or a buffer. So for the benefit of all of us, or people who are probably listening to television, could you please clarify and explain exactly what the parameters of Vote 40 are, and if monies are not used, what will happen to them?
Well, thank you, Madame Ratanzi. As you mentioned in your question, Vote 40 is it's a very important step towards the President of the Treasury Board's agenda for improved transparency in the reporting of estimates requirements, and his ongoing effort to ensure maximum alignment between the budget that is tabled by the Department of Finance and the estimates that are prepared by the Treasury Board Secretariat to inform Parliament of the government's requirements for the year ahead. In this year, in the main estimates in 2018-19, we've taken a very important step forward by achieving that clarity between the budget and the estimates. The budget that was tabled in February identified the government's intention to seek authorities to spend just over $7 billion on a range of initiatives for departments and agencies across government. In years past, Parliament would have been left waiting for the estimates authority. There was no line of sight as to whether those requirements were going to be brought forward in the first supplementary estimates of the year, or the last supplementary estimates of the year, or even in an estimates in the year forward. This year, for the first time, we have taken the clarity of the budget that outlines the items by department and by initiative and by amount, and we have replicated that in the estimates so that parliamentarians can see very clearly what the government intends to do for the year ahead. This is a way of parliamentarians holding the government to account for the requirements to be sought by departments. There's nothing nefarious here. It is 100% transparent between the budget and the estimates document. In the event that items are not brought forward by departments for approval, as the President has made clear, those funds would remain in the vote. They cannot be used for any other purpose. We are bound by Annex A listed in the estimates such that we can only allocate funding that has been specifically identified in the estimates document by department, by initiative, and by amount. Over the last couple of years, again, as part of our effort to improve transparency to Parliament, we have taken the opportunity of the last supplementary estimates of the year to highlight to Parliament those amounts that have previously been approved and are not going to be accessed by departments, and we have frozen those amounts. We have made them unavailable to departments, and that same principle will be applied this year for TB Vote 40. Should funds not be allocated, then they will be identified to parliamentarians as amounts frozen at the year end. They will lapse in the fiscal framework, and should that funding be required in subsequent fiscal years, those will be identified in future year estimates documents. So therefore, to sum up, Vote 40 is, as I say, it's an important step forward in helping parliamentarians understand the connection between the budget and the estimates. There is no light between the amounts and the initiatives that are identified in the budget and the amounts and the initiatives that are identified in the estimates. And in this way, we have achieved alignment with the budget. We've provided Parliament with additional information by which they can hold the government to account, and they can regularly check in with departments and with the Treasury Board Secretariat and ask questions about the pace of implementation of these budget priorities.
So to clarify, you're saying this is more accountable and more transparent, but the Vote 40 has come to OGO. It hasn't gone to different departments. In the previous system, the supplementary estimates used to go to different departments. So if you could help us understand how that system has moved to make it more accountable. I am with you. The previous time, main estimates made no sense, and we were approving something that the budget had no relevance to the budget. But I think we need to figure out if Vote 40 is a temporary measure while you're moving from one system to the other, or is it a permanent fixture?
Thank you.
We only have about 30 seconds left.
Right.
Jobs.
The House of Commons has approved changes to the standing order for the duration of this Parliament in order to allow Treasury Board to move forward with an agenda to reform and align the estimates with the budget. And so Vote 40 is intended to be a temporary measure in accordance with that change to standing orders for the duration of this Parliament. We would expect to assess and evaluate this mechanism and then seek approval from Parliament in the next Parliament as to how best to move forward with the effort to align the estimates with the budget.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Mr. McCauley, 7 minutes.
Welcome, everyone. Mr. Mongeau, I want to start with you, please. There's 59 million, I think it is, for transport, 59.5 million in transport in the Vote 40. Can you walk us through how those numbers were included in the central vote? And what did you have to provide to Treasury Board to get it into the central vote as opposed to the regular estimates process?
Merci pour la question. Thank you for your question. In the framework of our various projects, what used to be, and I will allow my colleague to explain a bit further on Vote 40, but what we've requested this year is the authority to continue NPMO. That's the group or the committee that keeps care of the overview and follow through surveillance of these projects that occur north of 60. So Vote 40 on those programs this year will be about 1 million this year, and we're looking for a second year, potentially another million.
Protecting marine life, maintaining rail service for remote communities, strengthening airport service, servicing remote communities. What led you to directly to put those into, request those to be in the Vote 40 as opposed to the regular estimates process in your own department? Like, how did they end up in Treasury Board instead of your own department? No, I'd like to hear from the department, please.
Dealing with the Treasury Board approval process, I think I'm better positioned to respond
But, okay.
to the question.
Let me ask you the question then. Did you come up with these numbers for Treasury Board?
The numbers were developed jointly with the department for approval by Treasury Board ministers.
The transport worked with Treasury Board?
They identify their requirements and they cost those out, and then the Treasury Board approval process is the way in which the executive does their due diligence and challenges the requirements of the department before providing
Briefly,
approval.
then how did, for example, well, the items I just listed, how were they determined to go into the vote 40 under Treasury Board instead of Transport Canada estimates?
Right. As mentioned previously, the central vote is the construct by which we can take all of the budget items and bring them into the estimates. There were a number of initiatives, including from the 11 departments listed here,
Specifically
that
transportation.
were approved by Treasury Board in advance of the budget. And for the most part, these were initiatives that had previously existed, for which the authorities were sunsetting.
Let me interrupt you there.
Yeah.
Would this be for other departments as well?
I don't understand the question.
Well, you said these were numbers previously approved by Treasury Board. So I would assume,
These are initiatives previously approved by Treasury Board and by parliamentarians, what we often refer to as sunsetting programs. And so in this case, the initiatives were brought forward to Treasury Board for approval, and we challenged the numbers and made sure that we were satisfied with the requirements, and then they were included in the vote. Now in this case, what you're seeing are items that had already been approved by Treasury Board in advance of the tabling of the estimates. The choice to us, Mr. McCauley, was...
that's my question. Would this be similar for other departments and for theirs?
For the amounts that were part of the allocations initially identified when the main estimates were tabled, they would have followed the same process. Yes.
Okay. That's interesting because we asked other departments, and of course that was one of the issues why we asked you here today, is they weren't able to substantiate where the numbers came from. One of the departments actually, when we asked about what the details were, and you're telling me that they've already gone through the process, they told us to expect an explanation of what the money would be for before being approved would be preposterous. Their quote to us would be preposterous for an MP to ask what the details were when the money hasn't even been approved or the plan hadn't even been developed. Do you agree with that?
I'm not familiar with the exchange, Mr. McCauley, but what I would point out is that there are two
senior assistant deputy minister and the CFO for
there are two
PSBC.
categories of items in Vote 40. There were the $220 million included in the initial listing that have already been approved, and in those cases, the departments assembled here today can provide detailed responses to your questions about FTEs, the votes, the results, and the indicators. For the items that are in the budget, may I just finish? For the items that are in the budget that have not yet been approved, departments are in a position where, because their items have not yet been approved by Treasury Board,
Point of order.
they will have some difficulty in
Point of order.
explaining.
My colleague, Mr. McCauley, had a question for the department officials and wished to use his time for that purpose. And I would ask you as the chair if you could direct the appropriate witness to answer the question on Mr. McCauley's time. Very much, and I've suspended the time, so you're not being docked any time. I would encourage both our witnesses and our colleagues around this table to try and respect one another in terms of getting a fulsome answer when asked a direct question. But should Mr. McCauley, since he has limited time, want to interrupt to go to a different question to a different panelist, I would ask Mr. Pagan that you respect that as well. Now, Mr. McCauley, I understand that you had a question for Monsieur Mongeau. Please proceed.
Sorry, I pronounced your name wrong. So I appreciate that. We're just short of time. The strengthening motor vehicle safety in the Vote 40, there's 3.9 million. Allotted was 3,156,000, withheld 727. How did you arrive at the 3.9? And why is it the allocated, the spent, I guess, approved by Treasury Board only roughly 3.2?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll take that question.
So under the Motor Vehicle Safety Program, we develop a 3-year action plan, and based on that action plan, we identify specific activities that we want to undertake. We work with Treasury Board on those numbers. They include everything from the number of FTEs that we may require, to operating money we may require, to work we may be doing with provinces and territories, to work that's already underway. And we allocate, we develop numbers and budget requirements based on that we work with Treasury Board to determine what's the best.
What is the time difference between the 3.9 and the allocation of the 3.2 million? How much time apart?
I don't have that information in front of me, but I can tell you that what we look at is year over year what kind of work activity that we have underway, what we've accomplished, and what we need to accomplish going forward, and we adjust allocations as we go forward.
What would we know now that we didn't know a few short months ago when we put the 3.9 million in that would leave the $727,000 difference?
It could be depending on the kind of project that we have. It could be related to a research initiative. It could be related to work that we might have undergoing with industry, as an example, that they might be doing that impacts us. And that is a very fluid kind of work that we do that changes. It could change week by week. So we make those determinations based on that information that's available to us.
Thank you. Mr. Blakey, 7 minutes, please.
Thank you very much. And due to the time constraints, I'm going to have to try and divide my questions between some department-specific questions and some more general questions about the process. To Ms. Laniel from the Department of Finance, I'm wondering by what point in the year typically are the major new budget items approved by Cabinet? At what point would the Department of Finance know which initiatives off the departmental ask list are going to be included in the budget and which ones would not?
So my understanding of the budgeting process, and I am new at finance, so I haven't been through the process yet, is that it starts coming in the fall, but it does vary from one year to another. But there is no confirmation until the start of the new calendar year. There's no approvals.
So by January, finance would have a pretty good sense of what's going to be included in the
so
budget.
there's frameworks, but there's no approvals that have been done yet.
Mr. Chair, may I interject on this point? Very important principle here about cabinet confidence. So, Mr. Blakey, I do understand and appreciate the question, but when we speak of timing in terms of when the executive makes certain decisions, that is a matter of cabinet confidence. In response to Mr. McCauley's question about the difference between allocated and withheld, I would simply point out for the benefit of the committee, and we've been clear on this.
That's not my question. So thank you, but you don't have to answer somebody else's question on my time. You can come back to that with Mr. McCauley. So I guess what I am trying to get at, because part of the role of the committee is to evaluate the quality of the estimates process. I mean, and one of the questions at issue is how quickly initiatives from the budget are developed in conjunction with Treasury Board or not in relation to the timing of the budget. It's pretty hard to make that evaluation if we can't even get a very general sense of when. And certainly, I mean, by a certain point, Cabinet must have. I don't think we're asking for any particular detail, and we're not asking for the timing of any particular decision. We're just asking, when approximately can it be said that Cabinet has an idea of what the major new budget items are going to be. So I'm not quite sure. I think that's a pretty broad interpretation of Cabinet confidence. In any event. How quickly after new budget items are approved, so for any specific budget item, would that information be shared with Treasury Board?
Unfortunately, I am not part of that process, so I actually cannot speak to that. So.
Right, so we can't actually get answers that we would want about the process.
And as we've seen...
Well, how would you know how soon Cabinet has approved things that they haven't shared with you?
Because I am part of the process by which the budget is finalized, so I know when Cabinet is making those decisions, and I'm also sitting at the Treasury Board table when I see departments bring forward their items for approval. As we have seen in years past, there can be a considerable time lag between the budget decision and TB approval, and in some cases this can stretch out over years. We have seen in previous supplementary estimates budget items from budget 15 and budget 16. And so it really does vary according to the initiative under consideration and whether there are detailed discussions and negotiations required with other parties, be it provincial governments, NGOs, contracting, etc. And so there is no simple answer to that question.
Treasury Board is not an inherent part of the pre-budget process. In other words,
I would argue that they are. That we work with finance to do a challenge function on the departmental requests to determine that the costings are reasonable and that the program gap to be filled is something
So why is it not possible to have Treasury Board submissions for new budget initiatives done prior to the release of the budget, or at the very least the release of the main estimate?
Well, in fact, it is. And what we saw in the document tabled on April 16th is allocations proposed by Treasury Board for items that in fact have already
for
been approved.
$221 million
right.
out of over $7 billion. So a considerably small percentage, I think it's fair to say, by just about any measure.
The President has cited other jurisdictions, Australia and Ontario
Yeah,
in
indeed,
particular.
where that work is done, and in fact, that was kind of that was the promise made actually when the debate about extending the deadline for the tabling of the main estimates was that actually more items would go through Treasury Board. So I was hoping we might get a little bit of a different take, frankly, from the Department of Finance, because we have heard from you often on this, but I see that that's not in the cards. So there are some other questions I wanted to ask, particularly at what point would departments have been notified that funding was being proposed for their department in the new central vote, as opposed to an ask for them to submit through the regular approval process? Was there a memo circulated to departments letting them know about the new central vote?
Not to my knowledge. There was a conference call and a subsequent email, which I believe you've requested access to under the access to information request.
And when did that conference call occur?
Pardon me?
When did that conference call occur?
If I'm not mistaken, the day after the budget.
Okay. And so what was revealed to departments then, that some of the funding for their new budget initiative, or in fact all of it?
We explained in a fair bit of detail how the central vote would work, what it would look like, and how departments would access funding for those budget initiatives if the item was included in the central vote. For the items that had already been approved, no further action was required by departments. So everything that we're talking about today are items that have been already approved by Treasury Board, and that money will be allocated upon the release of supply. For everything else, this is, I think, in response to Mr. McCauley's question, these are items that are under development by departments, and so they are actively working now on Treasury Board submissions that define the program terms and conditions, how many FTEs are required, what results they hope to achieve, the indicators that they will use, the partners that they're working with, the contracts that will be required. All of this is happening in real time, and we have updated the allocations
And under the former process, that is work that would have been done before estimates or a particular approval came to committee for approval by parliamentarians.
Correct. In the former process, Parliament would have seen the results of those approvals in subsequent supplementary estimates.
So it's new that parliamentarians don't necessarily have the benefit of that work when they're asking departments questions about whether funding is justified or not.
Respectfully, Mr. McCauley, I would argue on the contrary, that what we're seeing now, what we're seeing now in the main estimates is a complete list of all of the items, and right now we have
just on the point of program development through Treasury Board submission.
Unfortunately, and I know that we have the Treasury Board officials here for the full 2 hours, we'll have to get back to that, and I appreciate, Mr. Pagan, you want to further expand on your answer, but we'll have to do that in a subsequent question. Monsieur Drouin, 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank everyone for being here. I think that's probably the most witnesses I've seen in one sitting. Mr. Pagan, I just want to go back to how we got here, and I know this committee and my predecessors have gone through, including Mr. Pat Martin, who and his committee in 2012, they'd gone through the reason why we needed to align the main estimates, and you've touched a little bit on it, and the budget implementation vote, so the famous Vote 40. There's other jurisdictions in Canada that do this, right? And I think Ontario is one of them. And the process, to your understanding, the process that they go through is very similar to what we're going through right now?
Right. Well, thank you, Mr. Drouin. And for the benefit of the committee, I'll remind them of the President's agenda related to estimates reform, where he wanted to fix the timing of the processes so that we properly sequenced the documents, have a budget, and then the estimates. That would also support a reconciliation between the two documents. That was pillar 2 of his agenda. The third was the idea that we might look at alternate bases of parliamentary control instead of votes by inputs, to look at purpose-based votes. And then the fourth was better reporting, primarily through reformatted tabled documents and online tools such as TBS Infobase. So in response to your question about how did we get here, there was a report from this committee in 2012 that identified many of these issues, and the President's agenda responds to that. We have fixed the timing, and with the estimates now after the budget, we are able to bring all of the budget items into the estimates, and again, by department, by initiative, and by amount. And that's a very important point, because in the past, we would have included a budget item in the supplementary estimates. We would have named the department, we would have named the initiative, and we would have had the amount, and we would have tagged that as, budget 15 or budget 16 or whatever it is. The amount of information that is provided in the budget implementation vote is completely consistent with the type of information that we would have previously provided in a supplementary estimates document. So instead of waiting to see when is that going to come and how is the estimates going to align with the budget, we believe, added to the transparency of the process by listing every single item that's in the budget in the same level of detail that would otherwise have been appearing sometime down the road in the supplementary estimates process. So there is no waiting. There's no gap between the budget and the estimates. We're identifying what we believe are the maximum authorities required by departments to implement the budget initiatives. With respect to Mr. McCauley's question about the difference between allocated and amounts withheld, nothing nefarious here, and we've spoken to this point. It speaks to the fact that the budget item is all in. It identifies the full cost of the initiative, whereas the estimates only seek the cash required to implement the initiative. The difference are amounts that are covered through other authorities. So we have employee benefit plan costs, EBP. Those are withheld because they are paid, there's a statutory basis for those payments. Likewise, when the department comes forward with their initiative, they are charged accommodation costs so that we can make this cost neutral for the PSPC to provide accommodations and real estate space for departments. So the amounts withheld reflect the other authorities required to implement the budget initiatives. What we are seeking is the cash, but we're reporting the full cost of the initiative, and again, we would believe that this enhances the transparency of the process for parliamentarians.
And I'm trying to understand whether or not what the opposition is bringing forward, whether it's legitimate, because I certainly, Ontario has been doing this for many, many years now, and we know that, well, the current leader of the NDP has not, I don't recall seeing in the media that he's been really adamant or against the current Ontario budget process and the main estimates now. Who's at the federal level, different story. But I'm trying to understand, in the spirit of collaboration, next year when we go through this process, again, is there items that you would look to improve in order to bring perhaps the whether it's warranted or not, what the official opposition is saying and what the parliamentary budget officer is saying? Is there a way that we could improve this process moving forward? Or do you believe that we've done a good job at?
I believe that we've done a very good job this year in providing information that enhances transparency, but this is not our idea of an end state. It is a step along the way to continue, and it's a never-ending quest to improve that alignment and transparency. As the President has said, there are jurisdictions out there where they start the planning process earlier. They can do the budget decision and the TD decision in parallel. And that's what we aspire to. But he's also said that will take a number of years to change the machinery and the processes related to budget development. I'd also point out that although we have identified the jurisdictions that we would like to emulate, those are not perfect models themselves, that even in Australia and Ontario, they include in the estimates documents a number of items that are yet to be developed or for which subsequent TV approvals are going to be required. And in fact, in Australia, that number approaches 10% of their estimates. Our budget implementation vote is considerably less than 10% of voted spending. So we feel that we have made an important step forward, but it's a step, it is not the end state.
Okay, and what you've committed is to publish, once the votes are approved, like Vote 40, so $7 billion. I know 1.2 something billion dollars have already been published online, so you're going to do this every month for the next...
Correct. Right till the end of the fiscal year.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay. I've read an article from Scott Clark and Peter DeVries, who've essentially, and those are not just, editorialists. They do come from, one was the former Deputy Minister of Finance, and the other one was the Director of Fiscal Policy Division at the Department of Finance, who are supportive of the changes that the President of the Treasury Board has brought forward. And they don't necessarily agree with what the PBO has suggested.
Interrupt you. I know it's going to be an interesting question, but Mr. Pagan will have to wait his turn before he gets to answer. We're now to our 5-minute round. Mr. Macaulay, 5 minutes, please.
Great. I just want to note one thing. Nowhere, I've read the 2012 report out of OGO about the estimates. Nowhere does it say create a $7 billion Vote 40. In fact, I've chatted with some of the people who are on the committee at the time. They're quite aghast at this. You mentioned that some of the funds, the plans were under development when we talk about items in the Vote 40 about how they're going to be spent. If they're under development, do you not believe that it's kind of incorrect to ask Parliament to approve money that hasn't been developed, or the plans on how this money is going to be spent hasn't been developed? Isn't it putting the cart before the horse?
Right. Thank you, Mr. Macaulay.
And sorry, just a real brief one, because I've got a couple other questions.
It's a valid point. And we struggled with the best way of achieving that alignment to the budget. At the end of the day, the estimates provide up to amounts. The money need not be allocated or spent. Our goal was simply to provide information to Parliament as early as possible in the fiscal year about the potential authorities required by the executive to implement the priorities of government as articulated in the budget.
I just want to read you something. It says, this is from the Parliamentary Budget Officer, there remains a lack of alignment between the budget initiatives and the planned results because the initiatives funded through this vote are not reflected in departmental plans. We brought that up before. Right. They're not developed plans, hence he says they're not in alignment. He says the government's approach to funding Budget 2018 initiative provides parliamentarians with information that only marginally supports their deliberations and places fewer controls around the money it approves. So again, we've got one hand we're saying it's more transparent, but we have the PBO saying it's not in alignment and it's actually taking away oversight and control. Do you concur with the Parliamentary Budget Officer?
I would clarify the points that he's trying to make. With respect to departmental plans, as we have seen in years past, we bring forward in SUPs A, B, and C budget initiatives that are also not part of departmental plans when they're tabled. And so there is no difference or inconsistency. There is a challenge, and I grant you that, in timing. We now have the estimates after the budget. We need to work closely with departments and with the Department of Finance so that we can properly sequence...
Let me just ask quickly in the departmental plans, when will the money that's shown in Vote 40 then, when will we actually see what the departments will achieve for results? And I would actually challenge you to actually read the departmental plans. I've been through every single one of them, and they do not provide any, they provide very bare information for actually what is in their estimates, much less what's in the Vote 40.
So two responses, two answers to your question, Mr. Macaulay. The first is that we did a demonstration a couple of weeks ago on TBS InfoBase, and our commitment to parliamentarians is that as initiatives are approved, they will be added to TBS InfoBase with the results to be achieved.
I've got another question for you. I think we're going to run out of time. There's two tables on the website, and Mr. Doohan referred to them, and so did you. The Treasury Board Central Vote allocations and a source and uses table. One shows 220 million. That's one where we've got vague details. The other is 1.4 billion with no details at all. Can you explain, and they're both updated the same day, what is what? Why do they not match? And we've heard repeatedly from your department, from the President of the Treasury Board, we would receive updated information, but we don't.
Marcia's team just led the update of those tables, and so she'll respond.
Yeah, the difference between the two tables is this. The sources and uses table, which is the detailed Excel table that goes item by item and shows items allocated, or in this case proposed to be allocated, as well as the amounts withheld. That's the report that's intended to be reported monthly. So we did post a notice in May that said that nothing had been allocated or proposed.
But we've been told monthly we will get the full details, and that's been part of the promise. Oh, don't worry, you'll get the full details of what the plan is, but we don't. About 1.2 billion with no backup. And
the
no
text
explanation.
report on allocations and Plan Central votes, that's the parallel report to the one that we publish with every supplementary estimates. And the intention was to have the same kind of information published for everything that was approved between April 16th and when we table supplementary estimates A, to release that all at that point. We could, if it's the interest of this committee, look into doing earlier updates of that, but that actually wasn't part of our original plan. But we could look at accelerating the release of the text information as well.
Thanks.
5 minutes, Mr. Shahari.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to go straight to Mr. Pagan. Mr. Pagan, I'm trying to get my head around at the outset when the $7 billion estimate was presented and was presented on table A211, and it's been itemized. What information do I have available in my position that I'd be able to make a decision whether this needs my approval or not? So I like to actually use two examples, referencing source and use document, the one that came on June 5th, especially the line item having to do with strengthening the Canada Border Service Agency. $85 million, we've now allocated $73 million, withheld $11 million, and another line item, building more rental housing for Canadian families, total of $447 million. Now, there seems to be information available, and I believe this is as the details are provided to the Treasury and Treasury reviews it, and it says, now I approve, okay, that's where $73 million come. And there is very little information is available, or the file is in the process of you guys reviewing. That's why zero allocation is done. So at the outset, what information do I have available? Because allocated, it looks like at the outset, they're all going to be zero. So tell me what information is available that you made a decision on 73 million, no decision on zero, and why that information cannot be available earlier when you're actually submitting this document, so we could say, yay, I know everything happening.
Thank you, Mr. Jari. This is it's a very important point. It's a fundamental point, and it speaks to some of the, I think, confusion that exists around what we're presenting and actually what parliamentarians are approving. And with respect, I make this point very, very carefully. Parliament does not approve individual initiatives. Okay, that is the role of the executive. That's the Treasury Board function. The estimates process exists in order to hold the government, help parliamentarians hold the government to account for expenditures. And so what we have done in TB Vote 40 is we have itemized every single initiative that the government intends to bring forward as a result of Budget 2018, and that the House of Commons has endorsed by endorsing Budget 2018 in March. And so the information available to you facilitates that ability to hold the government to account for these items. How much has been allocated? For what purpose? How many FTEs? What are the results? What are the indicators? These are all legitimate and valid questions that parliamentarians can and should be asking departments as this money is, as the initiatives are approved and this money is allocated out to departments. Now we have before us today $1.2 billion of decisions that have been taken. And so parliamentarians can ask my colleagues about the specifics around that initiative, FTEs, results, partners that they're working with, etc. For the other items, as we've made clear, these are under development, and so we don't have the specific details of FTEs or partners, but we certainly have information about what the government would like to achieve as a result of this investment, and departments can speak to that as well. They can't get into the details of the discussions with Treasury Board at this point, but they can certainly identify in a fair bit of detail what they hope to achieve with the monies that have been set out in the budget. That is the principle around Vote 40, and why we believe that this actually helps parliamentarians hold the government to account for the authorities to be sought in fiscal year 18-19.
The government accountable after the detail is done based on the criteria that's been agreed on. Because aside from holding the government accountable for $447 million, the detail of what we can hold the government accountable, it's coming after it's been agreed on by the Treasury Board.
Well, it starts with an endorsement of the right. So, as an example, Canada Food Inspection Agency, strengthening Canada's food safety system, $12.7 million. That is an item that has been identified in this budget. Does Parliament support that initiative? And if they don't, they have the power now, the authority now, to reduce the amount of the vote or to strike that item from the vote. If they in fact support the initiative, then they can ask questions of the department. How are you doing it? What partners are you working with? How many FTEs?
Kelly or Mr. Kelly? 5 minutes, please.
I want to begin with a quick comment. We've had a fair bit of discussion around comparative systems, and it's been raised that the province of Ontario, it's been said have a system much more similar to this. And I would point out to the committee that the province of Ontario has the largest sub-sovereign debt in the world. I would suggest that we not take lessons from the province of Ontario on financial oversight. I would say that the argument that this happens in Ontario would be a counter-argument to allowing the implications, the potential implications behind Vote 40 to take root in the Canadian federal Parliament. But if I may move on to ask, we heard on May 22nd from Mr. Pagan about most Vote 40 items not having, at that point on May 22nd, having gone through the Treasury Board submission and approval process. So now that we have some department officials here, I'd like to maybe ask about some individual departments. So if I may go to the Department of Natural Resources. On your Vote 40 allocation, some $16 million, I understand. Which of these items have now gone through, if any, of the Treasury Board submission process?
Hi, thank you. My name is John Cozy. I'm the DG of Trade and Economics and Industry Branch at Natural Resources Canada with the Canadian Forest Service. Our numbers were 12.3 million, actually. If you have 16, then it must be as a result of EPB, I imagine, as well as accommodations that it's factored in. Our resources are dedicated towards full-time equivalent support of about 13 employees. It's a subcomponent of the larger amount of ensuring rules-based and responsible trade. You'll see that there's a $191 million figure over 5 years. Global Affairs Canada leads the broader initiative on softwood lumber, but we provide analytical support to their effort.
So which of the items? So I'm looking right at table A211, $16,050,000. 11 million for protecting jobs in Eastern Canada's forestry sector, ensuring rules-based responsible trade, 2.46 million, ensuring security and prosperity in the digital age, 2.2, protecting Canada's nature parks and wild spaces, 390,000. How much of that? I just want to know how much has gone through the Treasury Board submission process and what hasn't, or if you know the answer to that question.
My understanding is the 12.3 million for our softwood lumber secretariat has passed through the Treasury Board process.
is the funding over the duration of the project. What you're seeing in the annex is the requirements for this year, for 18-19.
So I have Treasury Board and I have the department officials here, and I can't get an answer on
I've just
how
provided
much
you the
of,
answer,
how much
Mr.
of the
McCauley.
1650 that is on table eight.
Single initiative, ensuring rules-based and responsible trade. And pardon me, and Marcia, it's the first two items: protecting jobs in Eastern Canada's forestry sector and ensuring rules-based and responsible trade. Those two initiatives have been through the TB process.
Okay, thank you. To Mr. Thompson at Industry, same question. How much of your department has gone through the Treasury Board approval process?
So the Department of Industry had 11 initiatives under the budget 2018, and of those only one have access to the Treasury Board process. It's the initiative improving access to the digital economy. It's known as Computers for Schools, and the amount is of $5.4 million.
Okay, it says 4.6 in the, I'm talking about Vote 40.
In Vote 40, it's improving access to the digital economy, and the funding approved by Treasury Board is $5.4 million.
So that's greater than the amount listed in the vote that we haven't voted on yet. So,
Initiative, as Mr. Trump says, it's 5.4. 5.286 is the cash required to deliver the program, and then there is an amount that is held back because that's for the employee benefit plans of 113.9 million, totaling 113. Sorry, did I say million? 113,000 for employee benefit costs, for a total of $5.4 million this fiscal year.
okay, so
Mr. Kelly, we're out of time, but you will have much more time to ask questions as we develop along the route. Mr. Massé, welcome to our committee, and you have 5 minutes, sir.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. C'est un plaisir pour moi d'être.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. It's a pleasure for me to be here at this committee, privilege and an honor. As a former bureaucrat myself, when the President of the Treasury Board announces a new approach, I can assure you that a lot of people were applauding that initiative, because this way we'll get much more predictability in the projects or with the various initiatives that have been presented for approval and retained in the framework of the budget. So, knowing in early April that there's going to be funding available to undertake the initiatives is an excellent news. So I applaud this initiative, this transition to the new system. And what it'll allow the initiatives to go ahead, and it's going to be very important for many regions in Canada. Now, perhaps you might be able to explain to us, perhaps TBS representatives here, in the chart or the table that the Library of Parliament provided to us, the second one, there are some remaining 5.2 billion, I believe, and a few other elements. Can you explain the process to access these funds? We know that the budgets or the amounts identified on the 5th of June. Other sums will be allocated, of course, but how do they access the rest of that 5.2 or up to the 7 billion? Thank you, Mr. Massé, for the question. That's a very, very fundamental question to the process of how we work with departments for the implementation of these initiatives as announced in the 2018 budget. In the system currently, there are two phases, two steps. Initially, the government, in its budget report, identifies priorities for the government for the year in hand or the year ahead. After which, the Treasury Board Secretariat will work directly with departments to develop terms and conditions of the various initiatives or the projects that compose the initiative. We ask them questions as to how many FTEs, how many employees, the results sought, and the various criteria or indicators going to be used to ensure that the initiative is going ahead appropriately. Now, this process may take several weeks to months, and occasionally even years, to come to full fruition and to finalize the initiative.
By initiative and by department. There can be initiatives that are inherently complex because they're dealing with other jurisdictions, whether it's Aboriginals, provinces, or even other governments. It is important that the department responsible for the initiative work closely with its partners to identify the results to be achieved, the resources to be utilized in pursuit of those resources, so that when they bring an item to Treasury Board, they can answer all of our questions about how many FTEs, where will the initiative be directed from, is it from Ottawa or from the regions. Et ce process-là, ça coupe de temps.
And of course that process takes time to finalize all the details. Only when all of the elements are in place or determined, identified, are they prepared to present this to the minister. All right. In the past, the departments either had to go forward with a supplementary request in May, subs A, subs B would be January, February, and C, and so forth. Now, for the funds that are left, after the 5.2, is it the same mechanism that will be triggered to access the remainder? I mean, once, of course, the initiative has been approved. All of the initiatives that compose the $7 billion. It's these discussions that will allow them to, between Treasury Board and the department.
Answer that question. We're going to the final submission in this round. It's 3 minutes for Mr. Blakey and colleagues. Following that, I will suspend for just a few moments while the next group of panelists and witnesses come to the table. Mr. Blakey, you have 3 minutes.
Thank you very much. I wanted to ask you, Mr. Scott Douglas, from the National Research Council. There's an allotment or an allocation in the update from June for just about $53 million for the National Research Council under the rubric Convert Sunsetting Funding into Permanent Funding. Now, I know that's not mentioned as an item in the departmental plan, although there is some time spent in the departmental plan explaining that a number of apparent funding reductions are the result of programs sunsetting. So I'm just wondering if the goal of this money is to prevent having that lag of kind of not knowing what's going to be approved or not. How does having the money meant to stop the sunsetting in a central vote that lapses at the end of the year that would then presumably have to be reapproved next year as well, how does that address the issue of sunsetting for the National Research Council?
Thank you for the question. The 52.4 million, once you add in the EBP, it's about 59.6. That funding will be ongoing funding. It has until now been sunsetting funding. Indeed, it started in about 2000. It's been renewed by the government at Treasury Board 8 times since that time. And in this budget and going forward, it will be ongoing.
But the authority here is only for this fiscal year, and we've just heard that it'll lapse at the end of the year. So how is it that we can end a sunsetting provision with a vote that ends at the end of the year? Wouldn't it make more sense to be incorporating this money into your regular departmental estimates so that it can be part of a regular vote, or could government not seek statutory authority in order to have that become statutorily allocated money as opposed to having it come back to Parliament for a vote every year?
I think Mr. Pagan's going to answer that.
That's exactly what's going to happen. The department is accessing the funding this year through the central vote, and in future years, because it's permanent funding, it will be part of their main estimates and will be reflected in their departmental plans automatically.
Okay. you can appreciate the conceptual tension in allocating funds to end sunsetting within a 1 year.
For most of the initiatives in this table, there is a tail in future years, and so all you're seeing is the estimates authorities for this year. The amounts will be reflected in the main estimates in the proper votes.
For the Department of Industry, for the item improve.
You will have an opportunity in a few moments to continue your line of questioning. Colleagues, I'm going to suspend for a few moments now. The Treasury Board officials will, of course, stay at the table while we reset with our next round of panelists. We will suspend. Colleagues, reconvene the meeting now if we may. And colleagues, just a point of information for all of you. We will have to deal with the main estimates on Treasury Board Secretariat at the conclusion of this meeting, so I'll be suspending this meeting probably around 10 minutes to 1, and we can discuss Vote 40 at that time. But in the interim, we will have a group of witnesses who are with us again today, and to reiterate, we have representatives from the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, the Department of the Environment, Department of Fisheries and Oceans, Department of Foreign Affairs, Trade and Development, Department of Indigenous Services Canada, and finally the Office of the Commissioner for Federal Judicial Affairs. And as always, we have Mr. Pagan and his officials with us as well. Once again, we'll continue on with our round of questioning, starting with a 7-minute round, and Mr. Peterson, you were first up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate everyone being here. We have, I think, 13 or 14 departments and ministries represented at today's meeting, so it's nice to see the accessibility that we're being granted as parliamentarians when we're considering voting on Vote 40. I just want to, before I get into some detailed questions about some of the department budgeting and funding, one of my colleagues earlier alluded to the debt of a province here. And I mean, the estimates in the budgeting process really have no impact on the deficit or surplus. Is that correct? It's just, isn't that more of a policy set by the government? And the process we're going through today would have no impact, I don't think, on the deficit or surplus of a current year, would it?
Right. Well, thank you, Mr. Peterson. Our colleagues in the Department of Finance, when they are setting a budget for any particular year, they look at the widest possible frame to develop their fiscal policy. And they will approach the consideration of budget requests with an understanding of how decisions are going to change or impact the fiscal situation of the government. And so in Budget 18, it includes deficit and debt projections that, or the deficit and debt projections include the initiatives that are identified in the budget. And so our deliberations here today have no impact on those numbers because they have already been taken into consideration by the Department of Finance at the time of setting the budget.
That's what I thought too. So I was just curious why anyone would raise that issue, but I guess they were confused. So I'm going to go to some of the department spending here. These are I think we have Canadian, Ms. Jordan's here, Canadian Food. There you are. So, you know, budget 2018, that's 21, sorry, $1 million, which makes up the $7 billion that we're talking about in Vote 40. There's $21 million for, I think, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. Can you elaborate on some of that is, or just where's that funding going and why is it necessary?
Yes, we have two initiatives that are being continued. So these are initiatives that were sunsetting at the end of 17-18, and one is securing market access for Canadian agriculture and seafood products. And under that initiative, we have a number of FTEs responsible for advancing and resolving market access issues. We are also have some funding in there to participate in the negotiation of free trade agreements, and we are participating in international standard setting in with the IPPC Codex and the OIE. So in our animal health and plant health and food safety international standard setting bodies, we are represented there to ensure that Canada's interests are pursued. Some of the funding is also for improving food safety, and there we're very active in terms of assessing risks so that we can adjust our programming going forward, producing risk profiles and adjusting our program based on our changing risk landscape. We are also adjusting our inspection activities based on data that we are gathering on risk in individual establishments. We are undertaking offshore prevention activities, so we are sending missions abroad so that they can assess foreign food safety systems, and also share best practices with some of our trading partners. And the last item in terms of improving food safety is undertaking a lot of activities so we can promote compliance with our food safety regulations. We have new regulations coming on stream in the very near future, and we want to ensure that we have the highest degree of compliance with our new food safety regulations.
So when you say compliance or promoting compliance, would that be reaching out to stakeholders, educating them, informing them of the new procedures?
So we are reaching out to stakeholders. We are producing a lot of plain language materials and online tools that stakeholders will have access to, and we have set up a database of information for our stakeholders, and we have a service called Ask CFIA that we have rolled out so that stakeholders can call in and ask questions and be well informed of the new regulations.
Okay, and as Canadians enter new free trade agreements and market access, you said some of the funding's for market access. How do you sort of build in contingencies, not necessarily knowing when certain agreements are going to come into force and things of that nature when you're doing the budgeting?
On market access issues, once free trade agreements are signed, there's a process that kicks in so that we can work with individual countries and negotiate terms for plant and trade in plant products, animal health, and food products. And we work with stakeholders and we set priorities for market access issues and assess which markets are most important to our stakeholders. And that's an annual process, the priority setting process, and then we work through the market access issues in concert with our regulated parties.
Okay, thank you. How's my time? It's just 1 minute. Okay, I'm going to move to, I appreciate your answers. Thank you for that. Move to the Department of the Environment, I think. Ms. Fernando is with us. Again, the amount of your budget funding under Vote 40 is close to 72 million. Can you elaborate on what a lot of that's going to, and why, I guess, essentially why we should approve it as parliamentarians? Sorry for leaving you out on the line.
To be precise, I believe that there are 3 different elements of Vote 40, of which I can really only speak to one element, and that's with regards to weather and water services, which is really about modernizing Canada's weather forecasting system, improving the backbone to how we forecast weather, how we disseminate weather, and ensuring that Canadians have access to the best possible products, i.e. the most precise and accurate and with the most lead times in terms of weather forecasting.
7 minutes, please.
Chair, and while it was entertaining to hear Mr. Peterson continue to defend the fiscal governance model of the Government of Ontario less than a week after that government was completely run out of the, not quite completely, down to 7 seats, I guess, but the point, I think, is that fiscal governance and overall fiscal health of a polity are indeed interconnected. We had testimony in the previous panel about how items that had gone through the Treasury Board Secretariat process from since the table was prepared for us that have exceeded the amounts in the table that we haven't even voted on yet. So I would submit that governance models do count and they do affect overall fiscal health. If I can then go to the departments that we've got here, we heard again on May 22nd that most Vote 40 items had not gone through the Treasury Board submission, but we have been told that they are continuing to work through and that this is an ongoing process. So now we have a variety of departments here, and I'd like to ask some of the individuals here from different departments which of their items have been through the Treasury Board process now. So I'll maybe start with Ms. Jordan and the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. Your $22.5 million under Vote 40, how much of that has been vetted through Treasury Board now?
It has been vetted through Treasury Board.
All of it. Are they in your departmental plans now? Have there been updates to your departmental plans to include those funds?
I'd have to double check that for you.
Okay, thank you. Department of the Environment. Ms. Fernando.
May I, Mr. Kelly, just on that point, departmental plans, they're tabled once a year, and so they would not be retabled, and that is consistent with how we have done budget items in the past, where items are brought forward in subs A, B, and C without having been in the departmental plans. Now that it's approved, it will be reflected in main estimates next year for the CFIA, and it will be in their departmental plans next year.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Fernando, 71 million for the Department of Environment.
So of that, to my knowledge, the only piece that's been approved by Treasury Board is the revitalization of Canada's weather services.
Sorry, that's the item that has been vetted?
Yes, it has.
Okay, and the other items have not?
The other items are in the process of being developed for Treasury Board consideration.
Okay, they're in the process of being developed even as we are asked to vote on the money.
Again, Mr. Kelly, this is consistent with our intention of providing parliamentarians, for your benefit, a forward-looking view of the requirements of departments so that you can hold the government to account for those items. And so in the case of the environment, there are 3 initiatives, one of which has been approved. You can inquire as to the aspirations of the other 2 initiatives. It's not yet been approved, but we can provide an indication of what the government expects to achieve.
I understand the intention.
Yep.
And I understand and heard you earlier on the point of the Parliament having passed the budget, but the Constitution requires that we approve the estimates, and the fact that we've just approved a budget does not constitute sufficient grounds to simply agree that a vote like Vote 40, where items under development that have not yet gone to Treasury Board for their and are not ready to go to Treasury Board for their funds, ought to be simply pre-approved by parliamentarians. And I'm interested, since we do have the different department officials here, to get a sense, just at least of the departments that we were fortunately able to get today, and I'm pleased that we have a good turnout. To find out and get a sense of how far along we are on actually going through the proper financial management processes that we have for money that is going to be put to a vote by parliamentarians. So if I may move to Fisheries and Oceans, and Mr. Martel,
than 19 million from budget 2018, there's 22 million for the sustainable aquaculture that was approved by Treasury Board, and we're finalizing the small craft harbor allocation also, but it's not final yet.
Okay, so say that again. You've got 216 million in Vote 40, and the item that has been vetted through Treasury Board is which item?
The sustainable aquaculture program.
Sustainable aquaculture. Okay, yeah. And how much?
That's 21.6 million over 2 years.
Okay, over 2 years. Okay, so
it's an important point because you suggested earlier that we've allocated more than is indicated in the annex, and that is not the case. What you're seeing in the annex is the single-year profile for 18-19. Many of these initiatives are funded over 2, 3, 4, and 5 years, and so what Treasury Board does is they approve the initiative once. For all the years, and what you're seeing
so this is an important answer to these questions to clarify.
I'm happy to provide I'm happy to provide that clarification. And so, just be clear, there is not an area where we have allocated more funds this year than what is indicated in the annex.
Okay. So on Fisheries and Oceans, then we have one of the items of the 200 and some odd million that has been approved. Yeah, 216. If I maybe just quickly, then I know time is, are we doing this? Okay, just very quickly maybe on the Department of Foreign Affairs. I want to actually ask about the ensuring security and prosperity in the digital age. We saw this as a common thread through a variety of departments, a couple of the departments that were here in the previous panel, and this is part of the problem we have with the, or some of it have with the way the information is presented to us. Ensuring security and prosperity in the digital age, surely a worthy undertaking. I mean, who wouldn't disagree or who wouldn't agree with that we should ensure security and prosperity in the digital age? But it's not really much of a description of what the money is actually spent on. So could you let us know if that item is one that has now been through Treasury Board, and if so, exactly what is that, are those funds going to be spent on?
Saying on occasion, the amount of time allocated for questions is both for the question and the answer. Since we've run out of time, we'll have to go to our next intervener, which is Mr. Blakey, for 7 minutes.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to start by reassuring Mr. Drouin that one of the reasons this hasn't come up in Ontario is that, notwithstanding the fact that it's pointed to as an example of what the government here would like to do, there is no central budget implementation vote in Ontario. And if you'd like to refer to the various votes that are posted online, be happy to share that URL. So, I mean, for as much as they do coordinate between finance and the Treasury Board, they didn't opt for one kind of omnibus vote as the way to bring about that alignment. It seems to me, and you let me know if you think I'm being unfair, Mr. Pagan, that the job of Treasury Board is to provide accountability, and they do that through their challenge function. So when departments come to them and say, hey, this is more or less what we want to do, this is how we plan to do it, Treasury Board pushes back and says, well, have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? This might be a better way. Have you tried this or thought about that? And that's where the accountability lies. Is that a pretty fair assessment of how Treasury Board works?
The Treasury Board process is very much designed to ensure accountability for the funds allocated, and so there is a very rigorous due diligence process where we seek to understand the modalities of program implementation, partners that you're working with.
And departments likely perform better, I think, as a result of that challenge, right? It helps them. It's important to their internal process. And it provides some meaningful accountability after the fact because they demonstrate what they're committed to. Now, when it comes to Parliament, you've said that Parliament should be satisfied with getting information about how departments spend money after the fact, and that doesn't inhibit the accountability function of Parliament in any way. If departments were to come to Treasury Board and say, approve the money up front, we'll go away, we'll prepare a plan, and we'll let you know how we spent the money after we spent it. But don't worry, we'll give you lots of detail. Do you think the Treasury Board could do its accountability function if it only got information retrospectively? Or do you think that it's part and parcel of the notion of accountability that some of that work be done beforehand, and that the person meant to hold someone accountable for funding has an obligation to ask questions and evaluate the answers, which presumes the answers exist, prior to granting that approval?
Just to be clear, Mr. Blakey, what I said is that the purpose of the estimates is to provide information so that parliamentarians can hold the government to account. Parliament does not approve individual projects the way the Treasury Board does.
But surely, Mr. Pagan, surely we're talking about $54 million to the Canada Border Services agencies under these estimates. Well, under Vote 40. It's considerably more under their estimates, but under Vote 40.
Right.
Do you think it doesn't matter to parliamentarians whether that money is going to be used to hire more staff, buy more guns, or build a wall?
I think that those are very important questions, and parliamentarians now have the ability to ask the department involved just how they propose.
Do you think it's satisfactory that we would get that information after the money is already spent?
Well, in fact, the process of the estimates process is very much built around that fundamental architecture.
Does the leverage for Treasury Board with other departments not come from the fact that Treasury Board can withhold approval if they don't like the details of a program?
I believe that there is definitely value to departments and to the public service by Treasury Board exercising.
And why should Parliament be expected to hold the government to account without similar leverage? And is not the purpose of government voting on these funds the fact that, and notwithstanding the fact we're in a majority government right now, so granted, it's unlikely that this Parliament would refuse this government those funds. It may happen, it could happen if you have a good process, doesn't mean it will happen. But in other situations where the government doesn't have a majority, presumably this kind of information would be very valuable to parliamentarians who do have the opportunity to deny certain funding to government.
Right. Mr. Blakey, I take the point. I understand your concern, but what you're talking about goes to the heart of responsible government. the fact that the executive takes decisions to deliver programs and services to Canadians, and Parliament's role is to hold the government to account for that. And so, by definition, by nature, the decisions are taken by the executive, and they are necessarily provided
Under
to
the
Parliament.
system of responsible government, government has an obligation to make the case for Parliament that what they're planning to do with taxpayers' money makes sense. And on the basis of those answers, Parliament either approves or rejects proposals for funding. Right. That's why government comes to Parliament to ask for the money. So on your notion of accountability, the picture that you're painting is that somehow Parliament is meant to hold government to account without any leverage, and that it's immaterial to parliamentary accountability how it is the government intends to implement a high-level goal. So if the high-level goal is supporting the Canadian Border Services Agency, there's a number of ways that you could do that. And it makes perfect sense that Parliament might approve of some ways and not approve of other ways. And the point about Vote 40 is that we're now being asked to approve that funding without knowing the way in which the government intends to pursue that high-level goal. Do you not agree that there's a problem in the basic notion of accountability that represents?
Respectfully, Mr. Blakey, I would disagree.
Well, you would not adopt that model of accountability for Treasury Board. You would not say that it is adequate for Treasury Board to be told retrospectively by departments after the money was spent what they did with it, and that Treasury Board could somehow do its accountability function after the fact, because then they could have a nice conversation with them about how poorly they did, instead of having the conversation in advance saying, whoa, where you're going doesn't make sense, put the brakes on, you can't have the money until you come back with a better answer. And respectfully, there is a role of Parliament to do that.
Mr. Blakey,
Parliament isn't here just to sign a blank check to the government and then criticize them after the fact. If Parliament's going to be a meaningful place, it's a place where parliamentarians should get answers from government on what they plan to do with the money before the approval is granted. That actually means that some of this conversation can benefit the development of those programs and where they go. And I take your point that we don't need to be involved in the minutiae of the delivery detail. But if our accountability function is to make any sense at all, it can't be the case that it's only retroactive, because we can't take the money back after the fact. Once it's spent, just as Treasury Board can't take the money back after the fact, which is why Treasury Board would never accept the proposition that somehow it could do its accountability function only retroactively.
I'd like to make a response, and I'm quite confident you'll have that opportunity with one of the government's questions to you, because we are now going to Monsieur Ayoub. 7 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. C'est toujours intéressant.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. It's always interesting to see the state of mind of the opposition on government operations. And the official is applying exactly what the government has charged him to do. When we have before us information to be accountable, as you say in English, you can ask questions on specifics and not just on the process, which you don't agree with. But regardless of how it will be done, you may not be satisfied whether you're in opposition or in government. I'd like to use my time as efficiently as possible, and I would like to ask you some questions on what you're doing when you're spending this money. I'm going to use Indigenous Services Canada. So, Mr. Tophill, perhaps you could talk to us about the $1 billion here that we see in the 2018 budget. Some amounts have already been expended or assigned. 115 million, I believe, just recently, and there's several $1 million left. Millions left. Perhaps you could give us some specifics. What amounts? What measures have been taken for potable water, for example, on reserves in our cities, in our developed areas? We take it for granted. You turn on the tap, the water's there. And it's not true everywhere in Canada. The Prime Minister has committed, and the government is committed to provide these services to First Nations and Indigenous peoples. So what measures have been taken to work toward that objective? You're quite correct that the issue of potable water is very important for the government. And if you were to examine the notes, the amounts of $100 million for water to move the plan forward to eliminate the boil water notices and the problems that they've had in those communities where they have not had potable water accessible for a number of years now.
There are 75, 76 communities across the country with long-term drinking water boil advisories. And the intention of the government is to eliminate that 76 within a few years. There is a challenge because there are a number of communities below that are hovering into moving into long-term status due to long-term underfunding of water management on reserve. So while the government has done essentially eliminated about 62 long-term boil wateries since November 2015. At the same time, there is another 30 that have actually achieved that status. So the money that you have allocated in budget 2018, in addition to those monies that have been provided through the previous budgets, is to essentially ensure that not only is that 76 eliminated, but that amount of communities that are on the cusp of moving into long-term are prevented from doing so.
Is there a date that you plan that everything is going to be met, so there is no First Nation that would look for clear water anymore? Is there a target date?
Well, I believe the Minister for Indigenous Services has been very clear as of January in her public announcement that she is very clear in trying to eliminate all long-term boil wateries on reserve in 5 years. And this money will ensure that, in fact, and while there is a plan, this money is in effect a contingency plan to, in fact, accelerate that by a year earlier. She also, in fact, expanded in January the scope of definition of what determines a long-term boil advisory from a public system. She expanded the scope of what is the definition of a public system on reserve. But notwithstanding that expansion of scope, we are still on track to meet that 5-year goal.
Okay, merci. Toujours dans le...
Thank you. In the same area, housing for Indigenous people. There's not a one-size-fits-all solution because the communities are quite different, one from the other, and their needs are quite unique. What approach is being taken to meet those needs, and what budgets have been allocated to make a difference in housing programs for First Nations? Housing, yes, housing. Water, you answered the question to my satisfaction. Now for housing. On the matter of housing, there are a number of different situations in the various communities, and a lot depends on their absorption capacity of the community. What do you mean by that? Capacity?
The community in order to manage a home, because a home division is not just installing a house. If you create a subdivision, then you also have to create roads, there's sewers, there's lightings, there's a whole, you have to clear the lot. There's a whole bunch of what I would call different elements before you can actually get the house onto the lot, right? The actual building of the house is the final step in creation of a home subdivision. Now, obviously, we have 630 odd communities across this country, and there are various levels of capacity. We have those who are very strong, who have significant own source revenues to supplement their parliamentary appropriations, and they have the capacity to do home subdivisions and do a number. There are others that are very low capacity, and maybe we can only do one or two based on their capacity to deliver. So, ça c'est un critère.
Thank you
very much. I'm out of time, I think.
We'll now go to 5-minute rounds, starting with Mr. McCauley.
Ms. Santiago, under the withheld on the sources and uses, it's about $600 million. Is that all employee benefits, et cetera, that Mr. Pagan was referring to?
No, it isn't, and thank you for the question. I'd just like to back up quickly. I believe it was the last appearance at this committee of the Parliamentary Budget Officer, where there was a comment on the lack of control and the lack of specificness in the language of Vote 40.
What would make up the other 600? What would make up the other money in the $600 million?
Okay, most of that $592 million are the amounts at the bottom of Annex 1 that are associated with allocations to be determined and the net adjustment on a 2018-19 estimates basis. The reason that we've frozen them and shown them as withheld is that in response to the Parliamentary Budget Officer's comments, we will be introducing more specific wording into the supply bill as along the lines of what the President mentioned at his last appearance here. So what that means is that we're now we're going to be in a place where we have to very specifically refer to combinations of departments and measures and amounts. And because in these cases, with the allocations to be determined and with the net adjustment, there are no departments specified, and with the net adjustment, there aren't measures either. So we can't actually allocate that cash from Vote 40. That's why we're showing it as withheld. It's never going to leave Vote 40.
Ms. Fernando, there's 3 items in the Vote 40. There's 52 for protecting parks, protecting marine life. Can you just walk us through what you're hoping to achieve for those for that money, just real briefly?
Yes, absolutely. So the first piece with regards to protecting nature, this is with regards to creating a fund, and the federal portion of that fund is contained in that amount that you see there. And the fund is to be partnered with NGOs and provinces and territories to purchase land and to carry out conservation activities on that land. And a part of that money is also to increase the federal capacity for protecting species at risk and for implementing the Species at Risk Act.
And the other 2 items?
So the second item is with regards to weather and water services. That's two different items. The first piece relates to modernization of the Environment Canada's ability to forecast and disseminate information on weather. And the second piece relates to hydrological services, which is a partnered program that we carry out with the provinces and territories, and the ability to be able to rebuild a lot of the infrastructure that is rusting out, particularly in Western Canada.
Let me ask you, you seem to be well aware of what the money is for.
Yep.
Can you tell me why it didn't make it into the departmental plans, and why would it not just be put in your main estimates?
I think Mr. Pagan can address that,
No,
but
I'm asking you.
my understanding is that due to the process that we have to undertake, which requires Cabinet approval for the Policy Authority and then Treasury Board approval for the spending and the other authorities, some of these elements have already been through the Treasury Board approval process and others have not.
3 items different from the other items in your main estimates?
Some have been approved by Treasury Board and some have not.
Ms. Jordan, you mentioned that a bunch of your funding is lapsed, or it's not lapsed funding, it's sunsetting funding, correct?
Yes.
If it's sunsetting funding, I assume you have all of the backup, you know what the money's going to be spent on, et cetera, et cetera. Why is that money just not in your estimates, and why is it not in your departmental plans if it's sunsetting money that you were mentioning going back to 2000? So we know what the money's going for, we know what your planned results are. I'm curious why it's not showing your departmental plans, and why is it in the Vote 40 not in your estimates like it has been other years? We have all the information.
So the funding is sunsetting, and so therefore we are not planning. We have to go through an approval process before we can plan for that money. So we have just gone through the approval process, and that will be reflected in our main estimates going forward.
But it's not in your departmental plans. See, what I'm getting at is you knew what the money was for. A lot of the departments, they've shown up before us saying, we don't know what the money's for, ask Treasury Board. Others had told us it's preposterous to expect to know what the money's for until you pre-approve it. You know what the money's for. You've used it every year. My question is, why is it not in your departmental plan to show what the results are going to be for that money?
So we will put it in the plan once we have the approval. So there's a timing issue at play here.
But we've heard the plan's already issued, so the plan's closed for this year. So it's
a timing issue with the approval and the winding up of the plan. So that timing did not work out. So next year it will be in our plan. It will be reflected.
We'll go to Monsieur Messet.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now, a little earlier, I was explaining that why the initiative is important to try to synchronize or align the measures of the budget so that the projects can move ahead as quickly and efficiently as possible. Whereas in the past, one would have to wait for the approval of a supplementary budget, sometimes 8, 9, 10 months later. The question I posed to Mr. Pagan earlier, I'd like an answer from him, but before he does answer, I have a question to Mr. Morel, Fisheries and Oceans. I see, Mr. Morel, in the report, 150 million for small boat harbors. That's a very important initiative. These harbors have been neglected for about 10 or 12 years. We have a lot of them in the lower St. Lawrence and in Gaspésie. Given this negligence, they're deteriorated quite badly, and we had to fight and invest a lot of money. I'm thinking of the wharf at Carleton that we resolved quite recently. It's going to be rebuilt, and it's a very important project for the community. In speaking with the minister, we explained that there are a number of others that have to be upgraded. I know that this 150 million is probably the first tranche of a $250 million initiative to modernize these small harbors. Now, Mr. Pagan was explaining the process, and now perhaps you could confirm, as of today or of April, you have access to those funds to invest in the upgrading of these ports as they become identified. Is that true, sir? Am I correct or not? Effectively, yes. There are over 1,000 of these small craft harbors. 700 have been identified as useful to and needed for fisheries, and others we're still looking for partners to transfer the authority of the port. So the 150 million and 150 next year will be used to support restoration and upgrading of these, or in fact we will be ceding them to a partner. Now, although the money has been identified, there are a number of conditions attached to the funding. We have to have a complete list, etc. And since the budget was tabled, there's been a commitment to align these and rank them by way of priority and the needs, etc. For first, the fishing industry, so in support of the industry. And there are no contracts that have been let. Since the budget, of course, we need the confirmation of the list of projects and individual ports that have to be done. And from an administrative point of view, perhaps you can explain the process. You've tabled a submission with Treasury Board, I suppose, and has your submission been completely approved, or is there still another step in the process to do before you have access? We've had discussions with the administration at TBS, not fully approved yet. We're waiting for final approval for the entirety of the package of these ports, this initiative. This is an investment in ports, and we want to see the finalization of the full list. Once the list is finalized, then we will move on to project management per se. Okay, I'm starting to understand the process a bit better now. Once the submission has been approved by Treasury Board for this 150 million, if I understand correctly, the department doesn't have to come back to Treasury Board again. They can go ahead with the initiative. They spend the money, they need more, they go back and get it. Of course, they're in constant contact with you to provide information, progress reports, or whatever. Yes, that is correct. Once the submission has been approved, the department will be in a position to go ahead with the implementation of the project.
Because absent, what we have done is we have provided to parliamentarians a full list of the measures to be implemented. Upon approval, those measures will be reflected in subsequent departmental plans, and the department will have all the authorities they need to move forward with implementation. If we didn't have this central vote, then we would be forcing departments to wait until the next supplementary estimates, which is scheduled for the fall, and they wouldn't get approval from Parliament until December. And so this is a question of balancing timely service to Canadians and moving forward with the priorities of government and Parliament's right to know. This is not a blank check. This is a mechanism by which parliamentarians can hold the government to account for the priorities identified in the budget.
Thank you very much.
Mr. McCauley, 5 minutes, please.
We have some more time. Mr. Pagan, you've mentioned this process. I'll quote you here, sorry. You can ask what the government expects to achieve from the Vote For money, and you have the opportunity to ask the departments involved. Now, we asked PCO in their comment when we asked about the money, they said, well, ask Treasury Board. When we asked PSPC about the money, they said, well, again, we haven't developed the plans, and this is when I was told I was being preposterous to ask what the money was going to be used for before Parliament approved it. So I'm having trouble reconciling your comments of, under this Vote 40, we have the ability to hold the government account and ask the department what the money is going to be used for, and also what the government plans to achieve for this money, because not one penny of the $7.4 billion is in the departmental plans. So not one penny is shown what we're going to achieve for this. So again, I'm having trouble reconciling your defense, for lack of better words, of the Vote 40 when we don't have the ability to, we have the ability to ask, but we don't have the ability to get answers.
Thank you, Mr. McCauley. As you've heard today, in fact, departments are in a position to provide answers. We just heard from Madame Fernando about what the Department of Environment...
Ms. Fernando, I'll give you points. You've answered better than anyone else, but it's a small, tiny amount. When we asked PSPC for 2/3 of $1 billion of taxpayers' money, I was told I was preposterous for daring to ask on taxpayers' behalf what the money was planned for, because I was told you can't ask for it, what it's about, until you approve it.
In fact, you can.
This is the problem with Vote 40, and Ms. Fernando's done a great job, and Ms. Jordan, a couple others have answered, but the majority haven't.
I would encourage you to invite the department back. Business and supply is an ongoing, it's an ongoing...
We've attempted to, and we've got voted down by the committee here.
I am certain that the department would be able to answer your questions.
Under the beautiful, in a perfect world, perhaps, but in our reality, Vote 40 leaves a lot to be desired that way for accountability and actually even getting questions.
Again, Mr.
Exactly
McCauley, what you've heard today is that departments, in fact, are in a position to respond to your questions. I would encourage you to have the department back to satisfy yourself of their priorities.
Well, we have answers for about $30 million out of $7.4 billion. Let me ask you again, the parliamentary budget officer stated about how this money will show up in public accounts. He says it will not show up detailed. It will just show up as a lump sum transfer. Again, do you agree with the PBO, or is he incorrect?
I'm not familiar with the particular exchange, Mr. McCauley, but with the public accounts, what the public accounts will itemize are the expenditures by department by vote at year end. And so if reference levels, if votes of a department X or Y are increased over the course of the year, then their authorities increase,
that's what I'm saying is,
and the public accounts will reflect that.
The $7.4 billion, not one penny would show up to taxpayers, to parliamentarians, on the public accounts in detail. It would only show up as a lump sum transfer.
And that's consistent with the way the public accounts are structured, because they will be reflected by vote.
Finish his question, please.
When we had your colleague here last week or 2 weeks ago from Infobase, credible program, he actually confirmed to us as well, it will only show up as lump sum. We will not get any access to the detail. So again, I'm asking, we've seen the departments come before us. We've seen in other committees where the minister's not able to answer. We've seen here in other meetings not able to answer. We've heard from the PBO that not one penny will show up detailed in the public accounts so taxpayers or parliamentarians can see where this pre-approved money is coming from. Do you still believe that it provides better accountability for parliamentarians?
Absolutely, I do, Mr. McCauley. And again, the structure of the public accounts is that Parliament controls by votes. So for every department here at the table, they have votes for operating, capital, G's and C's. What the public accounts do is they reconcile the authorities provided by Parliament by those votes with the actual expenditures by those departments by those votes. And that's not a vote 40 construct. That is the construct of parliamentary control. And as you know, the President is interested in moving forward and looking at some alternative means of Parliament exercising its control.
I gave you points for defending the indefensible. I believe vote 40 is an affront to Parliament, and I think we've seen enough from the PBO and from other witnesses that backs my commentary. But I give you points for trying to defend it. Thanks very much.
Member Tanzi, 5 minutes, please.
And Mr. Topel, if you want to finish the answer to Mr. Ayub's question, you have. Don't take too long because I have another question for you.
Thank you very much. I'll be pleased to do so. So there is a gap of around more than 80,000 in terms of housing units on reserve in this country. And as a result, from Budget 16 onwards, there have been investments made in infrastructure in order to deal with what is the infrastructure gap on reserve. To date, out of that more than 80,000 odd units in terms of a gap. Over the past couple of years, there's now 13,000 or more of that has been addressed. And discussions are going on in terms of with the Assembly of First Nations and other First Nation communities in terms of housing reform, in terms of how do we continue addressing that gap and ensure that that gap is addressed on a sustainable way so that it never comes back. So that's essentially what's going on right now with regards to that infrastructure funding.
So in Budget 2018, for the first time, there's a specific funding included for the Métis Nation. Can you explain how their needs differ from the First Nations and the objective of this funding?
Thank you for that question. So as you know, there are 3 main Indigenous groups in this country, the First Nations, Inuit, and the Métis. They all are relative to non-Indigenous Canadians have a socioeconomic gap. It's relative among the 3. The Métis, based on the department's own research, relatively better compared to the other 3, but the government's commitment is to address the socioeconomic gap for all Indigenous communities. You are correct that this is the first budget with a significant investment in the Métis space, and it is to deal with a couple of main planks. One is housing, whereby the significant amount of money is to go in. There is also money for post-secondary education. And that is all part of a frame that is also going on between the Government of Canada and various Métis nations in terms of advancing their agenda to move into self-government status, their self-determination aspirations. And this investment will essentially help in those discussions to eventually give them the path that they're seeking, self-determination.
And the last question is, the Department of Indigenous Service Canada, I'm looking at Table 2, has a budget funding in 2018 of $1.039 billion, out of which the funding withheld is $5,979,000, and then the amount remaining is $832 million. What is this withheld for, and where will this money, the $832, how is the tranche going to be flowed out?
I think I'll ask my colleagues from the Secretariat to respond to that. Thank you.
The question.
As Mr. Bacon explained earlier, most of the funding that's withheld, and in this particular case it's true, is for the portions of the program spending that will be flowed through other authorities. So for example, employee benefits and pensions are paid out of a statutory authority, and then accommodation charges and technology charges are appropriated separately to shared services and to public works. So we're showing in the table the full cost of those initiatives, but that parts of those payments will be allocated differently. The amount for about $2.8 million for renewing matrimonial real property, that was incorrectly reported earlier in the fiscal year as being allocated. In reviewing the decisions, we realized that this was one of the measures that was caught in the transition between the single Department of Aboriginal Affairs to the two organizations. So, in fact, the authority for matrimonial real property belongs to the other department. And so it will be supped in the fall or the winter to.
And my final question is to Mr. Bacon. What's the risk of vote 40?
I'm sorry, the risk?
What's the risk of vote 40? Because we are talking about accountability, transparency, we're getting confused with different information. What's the risk?
Yeah, there is no risk here.
Oh.
Completely out of time, and we're on a bit of a... But we have one final 3-minute intervention for Mr. Bleaky.
Mr. Barker, from Foreign Affairs, Trade and Development, there's about just under $30 million allocated now under Treasury Board Vote 40 as of last week under ensuring rules-based and responsible trade. In the budget, there's two initiatives mentioned under that rubric. The budget document talks about softwood lumber support, including legal fees, and it also talks about a Canadian ombudsperson for responsible enterprise. How much of the $30 million is allocated to each of those initiatives, or are there other initiatives that money is going to be spent on that we don't read about in the budget?
I'm happy to speak to the softwood lumber funding. So that is the amount of the $29 million. So all of that funding goes to the support for the litigation of the ongoing softwood lumber dispute, and also for the operations of our permitting regime for softwood lumber and logs. I'm not aware of the ombudsman, the ombudsperson position, but I can get you information on that and get it to you. But the $29 million is dedicated to the softwood lumber.
Okay, so none of that is for the Canadian ombudsperson for responsible enterprise mentioned in the budget.
No, I think they were separate. There were different elements for global affairs, but $29 million was allocated to softwood lumber.
Okay. In the departmental plans for the Department of Indigenous Services, we don't read about, and these terms don't really appear in the budget. They appear, but just in tables in the departmental plans, and these are the terms that we have allocations for. So the Labrador Innu Health Programs, First Nations Health Services Accreditation Program, Clinical and Client Care Program, and the eHealth Infrastructure Program. So if we're not getting a description of what those programs are in the budget, and we don't get a description of what those programs are in the departmental plan, where can we get a description of what it is that those particular programs are meant to do, and some sense of why the amounts that are allocated are allocated?
Thank you very much for the question.
Brief response, please, sir.
So those programs are ongoing. They were, for the most part, sunsettable, and so they are being renewed. And so you should be able to find some information about that in previous departmental plans, but it's when we're talking about a department with a varied myriad of programs with appropriations, of $9 billion, it's hard to kind of provide a level of detail that on each program that will satisfy everybody, but happy to provide a level of detail to you in terms of what you would like for each of those programs.
Thank you. To our witnesses, thank you all for being here today. You've been very informative and very helpful. We will suspend colleagues for just a couple of moments, and then we have some business to do. We will remain in public. We are suspended. We are remaining in public, but colleagues, we do have a little bit of business to do today, unfinished business, and that's dealing with reporting back on the main estimates. You may know that all other votes were deemed reported back on June 10th, the deadline, but the main estimates for the Treasury Board Secretariat has to be done today. Mr. Blakey.
Just ask that we break out vote 40 separately to treat it on its own.
We can certainly do that. We have to go through the process. You'll have an opportunity if you do not give unanimous consent. That's where we're headed. So my first question to you all, do I have the unanimous consent of the committee to call all of the votes under the Treasury Board Secretariat of the main estimates 2018-2019 together? No? In that case, shall vote 1 under Treasury Board Secretariat less the amount voted in the interim estimates carry?
It has to be unanimous to request.
It has to be unanimous. We did not get unanimous consent, so now we're doing it separately. I asked for unanimous consent. We did not receive it, so we're doing it separately.
Calm down. Calm down. You're going to blow,
he really was
blow an artery. Calm down.
No, I'm sure he was. I'm sure he was. Shall vote 1 under Treasury Board Secretariat less the amount voted in the interim estimates carry? On division? Shall vote 5 under Treasury Board Secretariat less the amount voted in the interim estimates carry? Shall vote 10 under the Treasury Board Secretariat less the amount voted in the interim estimates carry? On division? Shall vote 20 under Treasury Board Secretariat less the amount voted in the interim estimates carry? On division? Shall vote 25 under Treasury Board Secretariat less the amount voted in the interim estimates carry? On division? Shall vote 30 under Treasury Board Secretariat less the amount voted in the interim estimates carry? On division? Shall vote 35 under Treasury Board Secretariat less the amount voted in the interim estimates carry? On division? Shall vote 40 under Treasury Board Secretariat carry?
To move some of the reductions of which I served notice.
You have the ability to do so, Mr. Blakey.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'll begin by moving, and I believe in the notices of amendment, this was number 169, just for ease of reference for the committee members, I'm sure who have them all in front of them. And it reads that vote 40 under the Treasury Board Secretariat in the amount of $7,040,392,000 as it appears on page section 2260 of the main estimates 2018-2019 be reduced by $745,000 as it appears on page A1-7 of the main estimates 2018-2019 for a new process for federal election leaders debates under Privy Council office, in addition to any reductions previously agreed upon. And of course, Mr. Chair, you'll know that the $7,040,392,000 comes from the total amount of Treasury Board Vote 40, and the reduction amount comes from the allocation under the Privy Council office for a new process for federal election leaders debates, and that reference is just to help provide clarity for those, because normally you don't necessarily have all of the different moving parts that you have under a vote. So this is just to provide clarity as to where that particular reduction number comes from, particularly in light of the fact that we'll be considering a number, a great number, over 200 in fact, potential reductions to Treasury Board Vote 40. And I thought that this was an important one to start with because we did hear from the Privy Council office. And what we heard from the Privy Council office was that they weren't prepared to answer any questions about this particular proposed allocation under Vote 40 because they had no plan for the money. And I think members will know, I think I've been as clear as one can be, that I don't think it's appropriate to grant authority for spending when the government has no plan for what it intends to do with the money. So a high-level tale of what they're intending is nice, of course, but it's not what I think people expect when they send us here to provide some more rigorous accountability. It could be an important initiative, and the point isn't that the idea of reforming the process for federal election leaders debates is a bad idea, or that it shouldn't be done. The point is that there's a number here, $750,000, and before we say that is an appropriate amount to dedicate to that particular initiative, I think we owe it to Canadians to ensure that the government has a sense of how it's going to spend it, because there's a number of different ways that you could support a new process for federal election leaders debates.
Monsieur le Président, comme il est 1 heure...
Mr. Chairman, as it is 1 o'clock, I would like to perhaps suspend, adjourn the session for now, and we'll pick it up later.
On ne peut le faire sans une motion à ce sujet. On a la salle jusqu'à 16 heures. Et la chose qui me paraît la plus pressante aujourd'hui, c'est l'échéance à propos du rapport pour le budget principal.
In the meeting until we've dispensed with all of the proposed amendments for Vote 40.
Well, again, we have to deal with this today. So suspension, I don't know, would serve a very useful purpose, Mr. Blakey.
I'm not moving suspension. I'm moving extension. That we extend the meeting until we've dealt with the amendments, or until the deadline.
Well, we will be here, Mr. Blakey, until we dispense with your comments.
Okay.
Mr. Chair,
Past 1 o'clock.
Point of order.
Point of order, certainly.
You require consent to extend. So could you ask the committee if they have consented to extend the time?
I have not, only because the chair can suspend or extend at his desire. Since this has to be reported back today, I would love to deal with it if we could expeditiously.
Mr. Chair, but if we don't vote on it, it's deemed approved.
And we have until midnight. And we have until midnight until that occurs. Madam Tanza, I would love to. I know what you're saying, and quite frankly, I'm not quite frankly, I'm not enamored with the thought of sitting here until midnight. But from a procedural standpoint, that's where we're at. Mr. Blakey.
Well, thank you very much.
Do we have another point of order?
Can we look at the standing orders, because you need majority consent to sit past the scheduled time? Please, thank you.
Certainly. There's really nothing in the standing orders that prevents us from continuing.
Okay, you can continue.
Monsieur Blakey.
I believe I was just at the point in my remarks where I was going to share with the committee some of the possible ways in which one might go about spending $750,000 to support a new process for a federal election leaders debate. Now, one of the things that this government has done often and is a fan of, and in principle is a very good thing, is consultation, Mr. Chair. And of course, there's a number of different ways, even just under the rubric of consultation, that one could choose to consult Canadians on a new process for federal election leaders debates. Even if you just think of social media, Mr. Chair, and I'm sure you've seen a number of times in this Parliament already, the government has framed itself as a proponent of social media consultation and has done a number of consultations on social media. So one can imagine that if what's conceived, or if the ultimate plan for the consultation for this particular initiative is a Twitter consultation, which we've seen before, then as an MP, I think I have not just every right, but frankly a duty to ask why it is that we would have a $750,000 budget for a Twitter consultation. Now, the minister has a number of staff already. There's staff in the PCO. Presumably, Mr. Chair, some of those staff are adept at Twitter or social media, and they wouldn't have to bring in a consultant for $750,000 in order to implement a Twitter consultation. So that's one way that they could do it, and even within there, I mean, I think at that point the amount of money that we're talking about would be obscene. But even within the very idea of a Twitter consultation, Mr. Chair, I think what you'd find is that there might be some controversy as to how exactly you evaluate the feedback that you're getting from Canadians. So, is it retweets? Is it likes? Is it, is 240 characters really sufficient in order to be able to get a good sense of where Canadians are at with respect to something that is quite important? Of course, we know from the last election there was some controversy about the way in which federal leadership debates unfolded, and it had to do with whether or not some leaders, in the eyes of the public and their political opponents, were accepting enough invitations to participate in debates. Now, again, Mr. Chair, I'm not saying that this is a good idea, but one way that one can imagine the government might end up deciding that they want to support this process is by legislative changes that would then require party leaders to attend a minimum number of debates that are organized in a certain fashion, and we'll come to that, Mr. Speaker, I'm sure, over the course of this debate. But if it were, so say that was the upshot.
The information of all colleagues around the table, just to inform them, Mr. Blakey used the term debate. That's quite correct. We are currently debating vote 169 under vote 40. I'm assembling a speakers list. I have a few people who have indicated they wish to speak. So that's where we're at. If you do wish to speak, please indicate by raising your hands and we'll put you on the list. Sorry, Mr. Blakey.
Thank you very much for that clarification, Mr. Chair. That's helpful. So if it were the case that the mechanism that the government decided to use in order to support a more robust leadership debate process in federal elections was legislative, then again, I think we're at the point where we could say, why does the government need an additional $750,000 in order to support a legislative process that's already well supported within the existing resources? Arguably, I mean, due to the relatively small quantity of legislation this Parliament has seen compared to others, the legislative branch might actually be over-resourced for this particular government. So certainly, if it's a legislative fix, I think we can say that a $750,000 supplement to the existing resources is probably not appropriate. And that's part of the crux of the matter of what we've been trying to get at with respect to this initiative, but also many other initiatives, Mr. Chair, is the extent to which parliamentarians can make a judgment about the amount that's appropriate for a particular item in the absence of having departments appear and be able to answer those questions. And it's not that they're not answering those questions because they don't want to, or they're being deliberately evasive. It's because they can't, in principle, answer questions about programs that they haven't developed yet, and that's been a recurring theme. So, you know, Twitter consultations, Mr. Speaker, legislative changes. I mean, even under the rubric of social media consultation, I think many members around the table will know Twitter is not the only way to consult Canadians with respect to social media. You might be able to do a slightly more in-depth consultation if you use the medium of Facebook as opposed to Twitter. Facebook Live enables people to interact in real time with the host of the seminar. And so that would actually be a kind of real back and forth with Canadians. Presumably, of course, you know, if they wanted to do it more on the political side and do some political branding at the same time, they might have the Minister of Democratic Institutions conduct such a consultation so that she can interact interact directly, Mr. Speaker. But we've also seen instances where parliamentary.
And I do have to excuse myself just for a few moments to use the facilities. Madame Ratanzi, if you wouldn't mind taking the chair as I hobble off down the hallway. Proceed again.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. So I was just mentioning that you know, Facebook is also another way that government can consult Canadians on social media. Facebook Live is a particularly interesting tool that I know some members of government have used because it allows for some real-time interaction, question and answer, whatnot. And so the government might consider doing that. And just to bring it back to the amendment at hand, the question then would be, again, why would you require $750,000 to do a consultation like that? You know, I mean, access to Facebook is free for most uses, including doing something on Facebook Live. And that would enable government to be able to consult a cross-section of Canadians quite directly and save on the expense of travel, because of course sometimes travel is an expense that comes up in the course of consultation, whether that's a government consultation or as we know quite well, committee consultation, as this committee has traveled before. I recall sitting in, before I was a permanent member of this committee, when the committee was in Winnipeg on the Canada Post issue, and of course that kind of travel isn't free. But part of the point is that we don't know whether travel is foreseen as an item in the $750,000 asked for here. Instagram, of course, is another social media platform, and I'll leave it to experts to determine whether or not that's a good consultation tool. I'm more familiar with Twitter and Facebook, and it seems to me that they're more interactive in the appropriate way with respect to consultation, because it's difficult to get a clear sense of what Canadians might want for a federal election debate process simply through images. Although some Canadians are pretty adept at creating memes, and one can imagine that there might be some insightful and humorous communication by a number of those Canadians through an Instagram consultation. But I'll leave it to minds smarter than mine, Madam Chair, to envision exactly what that might look like. There, you might actually need to have some funds in order to develop the concept of an Instagram consultation. I'm not sure. But surely not $750,000, or at least I hope not. And if it did cost that much, I would certainly say that I think that's far too much to spend on a social media experiment, and that Canadians shouldn't be required to pay that bill, when it's likely that if Instagram consultation is something that has a promising future, I would think that at some point we would see members of the private sector develop that in order to realize its potential. And respectfully, Madam Chair, if they're not.
Point of order. I'm just wondering that what Mr. So I'm just wondering how relevant what Mr. Blakey is saying, you know, on vote 40. I don't know where you're going, Mr. Blakey, on this.
You don't even know.
Yeah.
Fortunately, that's not a real. You may have made an intervention, but Mr. Blakey still has the floor, and he's well within his procedural rights to continue.
Yeah, I presume that he has to at least. It has to be in relation to the subject we're discussing, which he stops us from voting on vote 40. So he could explain. But he's going on to social media and Instagram, and I have no idea where he's going.
Actually, the rules of relevance do not apply here. You will notice if you've paid attention in the House, even Speaker Reagan from time to time has said that he is constrained, while many people, even in question period, would like to see ministers ask or answer questions that are perhaps relevant to the question asked. They are under no compulsion to do so. Similarly, Mr. Blakey, as long as he does not become repetitive, which I'm paying close attention to, and as long as he does not refuse to answer or speak to the motion before us, relevance does not have any purpose here for this discussion. So, Mr. Blakey.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I hope members will feel that I'm being relevant because, and I thank Mr. Massey actually for making my point in part, which is that the problem with the money requested for this particular initiative is that we don't actually know what it's for, and so well, no, we didn't from the Privy Council office, and I recognize that the member is not a permanent member of this committee. If he were, he would know that when the Privy Council office appeared to speak to their allocation under Vote 40, they said very clearly that they couldn't tell us what the money was for. The program hadn't been developed yet. Now that leaves the door pretty wide open, and what I'm trying to provide in my remarks is some speculation as to what a possible program looks like that would support a new process for federal election debates. And my point was quite relevant to costing in that what I was trying to suggest was that if it ends up being the case, and we don't know because we actually have no guidance whatsoever from the PCO on what it is that they're planning to do with this money. They've been very clear. But we already asked the PCO. I didn't need to ask these department officials. I asked the Privy Council office.
And I know you're not a permanent member here, but Mr. Blakey does have the floor. So I would encourage all members not to interrupt as he is speaking. Once he cedes the floor, I do have a speakers list, and others will have their opportunity. Mr. Blakey.
And so my point, quite relevant to the cost here, was that if it ends up being the case that the Privy Council office lands on the idea of pioneering a new form of Instagram consultation with Canadians, and that they were going to spend $750,000 doing it, that would be a waste of money. And that is not something that I would vote to support. And because we don't have any assurance from the Privy Council office that that isn't where they're going to land, I can't, in good conscience, approve that money. That was my point, and I think it's actually quite relevant to the motion, Mr. Chair. And so, I take exception to the idea that I wasn't being relevant. I was talking about what a possible program might look like, and was simply saying that I don't think it's the role of government to be pioneering that, and added to that, was adding to that at the moment that I was interrupted, that I do think that if that were a promising avenue for consultation with Canadians, that would likely be developed in the private sector, and that the government could then benefit from the template established by companies who are consulting their customers within Canada. And at that point, the startup cost of doing an Instagram consultation would be far lower than what they might be now if that isn't already a thing. That's simply what I was saying, Mr. Chair, and I think it's quite pertinent. So all that to say that if we're just talking about consultation, under the rubric of social media consultation alone, I think it's pretty clear that there are actually a number of possible options. And probably under any of those options, a budget of $750,000 is simply too large a budget. I don't think that really makes sense. Of course, consulting people on social media isn't the only way to consult Canadians, Mr. Speaker. So even just at the initial program development stage, what you see is that there are a number of program choices that could be made, and I think it matters to how much money we approve under that rubric, which option government chooses to undertake. So imagine, Mr. Speaker, or Mr. Chair, I should say, that instead of doing a social media consultation, or in addition to doing a social media consultation, because a social media consultation doesn't cost a lot of money, the government decided that it wanted to travel across the country into a number of different communities. Not just large urban centers, but rural and remote communities as well. Well, then it would start to make sense, Mr. Chair, why you might need a large budget if this is consultation money. Because at that point, you're looking at booking flights. Again, I think it would be of interest to parliamentarians to know if that's a core aspect of what money is being asked for, how many staff government envisions bringing on that trip. So is this a minister and a political aide and 2 translators and a facilitator? That might be the bare minimum. And we might be interested to know at that point even whether $750,000 makes sense, or how many communities they expect that they can make it into at that price point, Mr. Chair. But if they envision having a larger team for consultation, then at that point I think it would be pertinent for parliamentarians to ask if that larger team is necessary or not, and to challenge the idea of how many members have to go or not go, as the case may be. Now, that's something that we do even at the committee level, Mr. Chair, as somebody who's been around this place for a while and on many committees, and I'm sure you've traveled with committees before. You'll know that sometimes arrangements are arrived at between committee members where the entire committee doesn't have to travel, but instead a reduced complement travels. And that's exactly because committees are concerned about cost and about the budget. It's not a sky's the limit kind of thing. And a similar principle applies to government consultation, Mr. Chair. And so that's why it's important to know if the government is contemplating a long period of travel. It's important to know how many people they think they're going to take with them and why they think they need that many people to go, Mr. Chair. You know, are they doing it in, are they running these consultations in the various communities? Are they doing it in community halls or local schools? Or are they renting out, you know, really fancy hotels and inviting people to what is ultimately, you know, effectively a hospitality suite? Those are things that I think committee members might be interested to know. And contrary to the remarks of some of the Treasury Board officials here earlier today, I mean, I think parliamentarians have every right to know and every duty to ask in advance of something like this, and then ask for $750,000, whether or not that is in fact the intention of government or not. And you know, one can imagine certain types of consultation. I think we've even, you know, heard tell of some more exclusive consultations that government sometimes does, even this government recently, where they're invitation only. So it's one thing to go out across the country and to speak in, you know, with Canadians in community clubs and schools in their own community, and to have it be open to the public, so that anybody who has an opinion on the appropriateness of a particular form or style of federal leaders debate can weigh in. And it's quite another thing to say, well, we're gonna rent out some ritzy hotel rooms in Vancouver, Montreal, and Toronto, and we're going to invite some powerful media magnates, and we're going to wine and dine them on champagne and caviar, and we're going to hear what they think. That too would be a consultation. I'm not saying that that's what this government would do. I'm saying that is what some government might do, and I think they would be wrong to do it. And I think Canadians would be upset if they found out that $750,000 paid for 3 consultations, where the list was closed to just some
Mr. Chair.
powerful people by invite.
Mr. Chair, if I may. So you said to me that you were making sure that Mr. Blakey is not repetitive, that he is relevant, but he's talking about caviar, he's talking about, you know, hotel rooms, and, you know, he's repeating hotel rooms, consultation, Instagram. So, I trust you, Mr. Chair, but you know what? I'm trying to see.
He's not being repetitive, and relevance has no factor in this.
Well, I found that he was repetitive from my perspective,
thank
but I
you,
don't want to.
I'm listening very carefully, Monsieur Massé, and you were in fact out of the room, and I was still listening. I have not found any repetitive nature to it yet. If it does, believe me, I will.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I am glad to clarify that the references to champagne and caviar didn't come out of nowhere. What I'm talking about is a particular way that one might choose to consult Canadians. And one way that has sometimes happened is that the government embarks on an invitation-only consultation. So now I am repeating myself, but only for the benefit of Mr. Massé, who I think didn't appreciate initially how it was that these remarks tied to the motion, and I'm concerned to do that for him. So if you'll give me some leeway to be somewhat repetitive, it's only for the benefit of Mr. Massé, Mr. Chair. So, of course, that is one way that you can consult. It's invitation only, and then the question is, well, what's the setup for this invitation only thing? And if you had a government that was concerned to hobnob with the rich and powerful, you can imagine that if they were given free rein over a budget of $750,000 and had little scruple, they might do something like order caviar and champagne to that hotel room for that particular consultation in order to make an impression that had very little to do with the substance of the matter, which is a new process for federal election leaders debates. And that would be something that I think parliamentarians of all stripes around this table would be concerned about, certainly something that they ought to be concerned about. So that is how the reference to champagne and caviar relates directly to this particular motion. It has to do with the potential uses of this budget and how you consult. Now, another way to do consultation for government, I mean, there's no magic to government consultation. It's about getting out and talking to people. And of course, the government of the day is supported by a political party. In fact, this government, as all majority governments are, is supported in the House by a political party with the most number of current MPs. So another form that consultation could take that wouldn't cost any money and therefore not require a budget, certainly not $750,000, would be for those MPs to go out and to door knock in their community and to talk to Canadians on their doorstep about what they think worked or didn't work about the last federal election leaders debates, and to try and get some good ideas from them in terms of how that process could be improved, and then to pass that information back up to the appropriate minister or to cabinet or whatever process they design in order to get that feedback. And that would be another low-cost form of consultation, Mr. Chair. So the point of the amendment is to highlight the fact that we don't actually have good information on what it is that the government intends to do with this money, and that there are many different ways that the government could be sufficiently faithful to the high-level goal that they might be able to say, we're honoring what we said we'd do with this money, but actually end up with a result that's very far removed from what anyone would have expected they would actually do with that money. And of course, that's why we have a process where we call departmental officials to committee and we get to ask those questions so that we can get a sense. Or, earlier I used the analogy of the Canada Border Services Agency, where it's all well and good to say we're going to dedicate money to supporting the CBSA and making Canada's border secure, but it's really not enough information in order to be able to approve that funding, because it matters whether you're simply hiring more staff, or you're buying tanks, or you're building a wall. Those are all different ways of honoring the high-level commitment. And I say, Mr. Chair, they're not all equal. They're certainly not equal, not from a cost perspective, not from a moral perspective, not from a political perspective, but they are all options. And so it matters to discern beneath the general high-level goal what the mainline ways of using that funding in order to accomplish that goal are. And when we had the Privy Council office here before us, they were very clear that they had not yet made that determination. We left with as much information as we had when we came in the door, and we were told not to expect any more information. So I've outlined how I think it is that if you were to just even conceive of this at this moment, because we're in the year before the election, as a consultative budget to go out and talk to Canadians, that you could have a number of different options with a number of different cost implications. But beyond consultation, when we move to action, and this is not, and it's not clear whether this line item is intended for consultation or intended for action or intended for some mix of both. There's allusions in the budget to more money next year for this same initiative, so we don't know, is this the consultation year and is next year the action year? It would certainly be strange if this year was the action year and next year was the consultation year, but you know, I've come to learn from this government that one, not set the bar too high in terms of expectations. Anything can happen. So
once again, Mr. Blakey, I don't want to be constantly interrupting you, but I would like to, prior to 2 p.m., and we've got 30 minutes, get a sense from the committee, consensus if possible. Do we suspend for question period and the votes afterwards? I certainly would be suspending for the votes because they occur immediately after QP. But is it the will of the committee to suspend so you can participate in question period and the votes and then we reconvene, or would you like to sit here until just before 3 o'clock? Any sense?
I'm happy to stay, but
yeah, I mean, I again would like to get a consensus. If everyone wants to go to QP, great. If only some of you want to go to QP, then we're staying. So one at a time, please. Again, I'm not hearing anything that sounds even remotely like consensus. So, Mr. Blakey, back to you.
Well, thank you very much. And I just to remind committee members where we were at before that discussion, it was just to say that I think what I've been trying to do is to outline, even if this were just a consultation budget, Mr. Chair, there are a lot of open questions as to how the government might go about it. But in fact, we don't know if this budget is just for consultation or whether it's also for action. We don't know if the action is planned for year 1 or year 2. I was saying that I think it makes sense, obviously, to have the consultation before the action, but you never know. And the point is we didn't get an answer. Even an answer as simple and general as that they plan to consult and then act was not given by the Privilege Council office when they were here at committee. They simply said, we don't know what we're going to do with that money. So we couldn't even get that much of an answer. Now, if people think that's silly, I would put it to the government why it was that they couldn't provide at least that much of a basic answer. And I think the fact that they were so ill prepared that they couldn't just say, we're going to do some consultation before we move ahead, and at least part of this year's budget is going to be to support that consultation, shows just how ill prepared many of these government departments are to plan properly for the money that they're asking us to receive. We heard earlier from a Treasury Board official, Mr. Chair, you'll recall, on this same point, which ties directly to the amendment at hand, that it wasn't until after the budget was tabled that departments got a call letting them know about the Treasury Board central vote for budget implementation. So here you have a kind of brand spanking new pioneering way of providing funding to departments for all their new budget initiatives, and they didn't even know until after the budget was tabled that this was coming down the line. Now, presumably you would think that they were working on some of what they were hoping to have in the budget, but of course approval for the budget is a policy approval, and that's one thing, and they wouldn't have done the kind of rigorous costing that goes into getting a Treasury Board approval. So then you kind of wonder where the number comes from, and I know that in response to some questioning by Mr. McCauley that departments have sometimes said, well, we don't actually quite know where that number came from or how we arrived at that number. And you would think that if they did some basic budgeting, they would at least be able to tell you whether they intended to consult in year 1 and act in year 2 or something. But we got nothing, Mr. Chair. So if we set aside the question of consultation just for a moment, and we move to action, Mr. Chair, then there are all sorts of possibilities in terms of how the government might act to support a new process for federal election leaders debates. And I feel like I should say at the outset that I'm going to suggest some possible actions. I'm not saying they're good or bad. All I'm trying to do, or that I support them or I don't support them, all I'm trying to do at this point is lay out some of the possibilities, because we've been given no direction by government officials in terms of where they might go or how they might act on this. It's incumbent upon us to consider all of the possibilities, and I won't pretend to provide an exhaustive list, but I hope to provide as exhaustive an account as possible as to what some of the various methods for acting on this might be, Mr. Chair. Now, I alluded earlier to the idea that it might involve some legislative work. And I would say, even at the outset, Mr. Chair, that if it does involve some legislative work, then I think we run up against some important principles of the House of Commons that call into question whether it's even appropriate for the government to be asking for the appropriation of funds at this time. Because it is a well-established principle around here, Mr. Chair, that if government is going to be asking to appropriate funds, it has to do that within its existing statutory and legal authorities. In fact, if there was any doubt as to that, Mr. Chair, we heard earlier about an initiative that was presented under Vote 40, having to do with matrimonial real property, that was initially listed under the wrong department. Wrong because that department doesn't have the legal and statutory authority to spend in that area. And so as a result of government making a funding request outside of the legal and statutory authorities of a particular department, Treasury Board itself has seen fit to remove that particular allocation and reallocate it, well, not reallocate it because they can't within the Vote 40 structure, and they've said that they won't. So it'll go to the supplementary estimates. So it's important that any money that's being asked for under Vote 40 be consistent with the statutory and legal authorities of departments already granted. And I would note, Mr. Chair, that the fact that that particular initiative will come in a supplementary estimates doesn't seem to have caused any sense of panic among members of the government or members of the governing party at this committee. I think they understand full well that not going ahead with a funding decision in Vote 40 doesn't mean the government can't appropriate the funds. It just means it has to do it through the normal process. So this isn't about stopping any particular government initiative. It's about holding the government to account to seek funds in the appropriate way that respects the accountability and oversight role of Parliament. And I think we saw some evidence that, at least with respect to certain items, government does see that. Another example of that, Mr. Chair, is found in the Departmental Plan for Veteran Affairs, where they talk about the program that government is proposing for veterans' pensions. And you'll notice, Mr. Chair, I'm sure you have already, that under Vote 40, there isn't any new money assigned for that program under Vote 40, even though it was mentioned in the budget, even though it's a substantial line item in terms of cost. And that's explained in the departmental plan in a footnote to a table where they outline what the projected cost of that new program is. What the footnote tells us is that they're not requesting that funding at the moment because they don't have the existing statutory and legal authority to do it, because there are legislative changes required to the legislation that structures the veterans pension program, and that it would be inappropriate for them to seek those funds before they make changes to the legislation. I've likewise argued in other places, Mr. Chair, and I think this is one of the problems with Vote 40, is that Vote 40 itself doesn't seem to fall under any existing legal or statutory authority of Treasury Board, which is why I've asked the Speaker to rule Vote 40 out of order in the House. The Speaker has yet to rule on that point. I'll be interested to see what it is that the Speaker has to say with respect to that, because I do think that is a clear-cut case of government requesting funding in a way that defies existing statutory and legal authority. My concern is that if the Privy Council Office requires legislative amendments in order to implement this new process for federal election leaders debates yet to be determined, and if this funding ends up being funding for anything that's not currently possible, but is only possible after Parliament passes some new legislation or amends existing legislation in order to set it up, then the government and Parliament will have violated that important principle, which is that it have the properly constituted legal and statutory authority prior to requesting funding. And at this point, we don't know. See, I brought it back, Mr. Chair. You're surprised, but I'm
hanging on your every word. Trust me.
I'm surprised. I'd like to hear that again because I missed the part of that.
Oh, Kelly missed some of it. He'd like me to go back.
You're just getting warmed up.
So that is an important principle around here. I think it makes sense essentially, and the reason that that principle makes sense is because it requires of the government that they not anticipate the will of Parliament. Parliament hasn't decided anything until it's decided something. And it's not for government to seek funds on a conditional basis. That is to say, Mr. Chair, if such and such a law passes, then we'll already have the money ready to go. Because that would be to prejudge the outcome of a vote in Parliament. And frankly, I think it's disrespectful to members of the governing party who aren't in cabinet because it essentially expects that they're going to do whatever they're told to do. And that there won't be times where government members disagree with the government and decide to act on that disagreement. So you can imagine we had a bill. It was a bit of private members' business, Mr. Chair. You may recall in this Parliament already on that effectively dealt with genetic discrimination and the ability or now lessened ability of insurance companies to require as a condition of insurance that people submit to the insurance company any information that had come from any kind of genetic testing. And of course, this is a problem. It's a problem in Canada that practice was allowed to continue when many other countries had rightfully done away with it because the problem was that insurance companies then may decide to deny coverage to people based on the results of that genetic testing, and that would disincentivize Canadians from doing that testing because they would be afraid to get information that wasn't positive information that they would then be obligated to share with their insurance company. And essentially, the upshot would be that from a financial point of view, they're better off not knowing, because that would mean that they would be able to get the appropriate insurance and get it or get insurance at a cheaper rate than they would otherwise get with all of the risk factors known to the insurance companies. But from a health point of view, they would be far worse off. Because if they made the choice based on the financial consideration, then they would be in the position where they were forgoing the opportunity to have the benefit of that genetic information to know whether they need to be assessed for early identification of various diseases or conditions. In the case of that legislation, the government came out very strongly against that legislation, Mr. Speaker, and in no uncertain terms. And they communicated very clearly to their members that they were to vote against that legislation. Now imagine if the government, prior to the vote, and spoiler alert, a number of backbench MPs, I think in the neighborhood of 40, I could be wrong, perhaps some members here have a better sense, but it was in the neighborhood of 40 backbench Liberal MPs did decide to vote against the government and pass the bill. And it's as a result of their efforts and willingness to defy the government on that particular piece of legislation that Canadians will now be able to go and get genetic testing and find out whether they ought to be checked out for early indications of various conditions and not have to worry that they're going to be financially penalized for that. It's as a result of that defiance, if you will, by a number of backbench Liberal MPs that law got passed. So that's great. But now imagine if the government had, for some reason, appropriated a bunch of, a bunch of funds for the bill to implement something if it had passed and it didn't pass, Mr. Speaker. Well, now you'd be in a position where what do you do with that money? That money has been authorized, but the conditions meant for it to be spent in didn't come about. Now does the government just change its plan and say, well, we didn't get the legislative changes we want, but we're going to refer back to the high-level goal and now do something that doesn't require those legislative changes? In that case, the money clearly would be used in a way that wasn't consistent with what Parliament approved it for. So that's why it's important that the statutory and legal authorities be in place prior to the funding request. That means that the government and Parliament itself isn't prejudging what the outcome of a vote or debate in Parliament will be. And I think we can imagine a number of ways in which having a new process for federal election leaders debates would precipitate some kind of legislative change. So I had alluded earlier, Mr. Chair, to the idea that, and again, just to be perfectly clear, I'm not endorsing any of these possibilities that I'm going to mention. Some of them may be laudable, others not. Some may be ones that I end up supporting, others not. But that's not where we're at in the discussion. Right now, we're just kind of spitballing about ways that we could have a new process for federal leaders debates because we haven't been given any direction by the Privy Council office.
Your opinions on which method you would prefer, but that's up to you.
Well, if we go long enough, we may get there. We may get there. But then I would be speaking to another matter, because then I would be speaking to the substance of what a new process for federal leaders debates ought to look like, and in my commitment to being relevant to the amendment at hand, I'm only talking about what the possibilities are and how those might reflect either on the proposed budget, $750,000, or on rules and procedures of this place. Hence the lecture on legal and statutory mandates, because I think that's an important principle that ought to be observed throughout the appropriations process or supply process. So, one way that the government, and I think this would probably be the most crude way, and I'm really not sure. I'm not sure it would be a good way, would be to, pass a law that mandated federal leaders to show up at a certain number of debates. And at the most extreme end, so I'll start with the most extreme and I'll kind of work my way through to more moderate versions of this position, Mr. Chair. But at this extreme end, the government might take it upon itself to simply name the dates and times and to set up the debate effectively on its own, and then require federal party leaders to show up. Now, the question is, what is the cost of these things, and where are the costs borne? So, if you were to take the most heavy-handed approach, Mr. Chair, I think what you would find would be, a government that legislates, and I'm not saying this is what the current government would do. I'm just saying this. I think this is, one of the most extreme versions that I can imagine. And maybe other members have a more vivid imagination than I do. And when their turn comes in the debate, they'll illuminate us as to the vivacity of their. I'm not quite sure how to convert that word, but anyway, what I would say is that, if you had a government that said, well, we're going to take it upon ourselves, we're going to set the dates and times, just as we have fixed election dates, we're also going to have fixed leadership debates within that cycle, and a federal party leader, a leader of a registered federal party that doesn't show up will be jailed. You can make it an amendment to the criminal law, Mr. Chair. That would be one thing. Again, I'm not saying that that's a good thing. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I'm just saying that's one thing that you might imagine a government could do. I think members would have some objection to that. Certainly federal party leaders might have an objection, both in terms of the substance, because they might say that that's really a punishment that doesn't fit the crime. They might say that they need to have some political discretion that they can exercise with respect to debates, whether they show up or not. You could definitely imagine them feeling that way about it, Mr. Chair. And of course, the other thing that would do is that actually supporting a new process for federal election leaders debates would probably, in that case, then be something that would incur new costs under the Department of Justice, as opposed to under the Privy Council office, which would be kind of awkward and strange, but there's a concert happening in the hallway.
No idea.
Non-stop.
Scared the bejesus out of me. I don't know.
Well, thank you, Ms. Ratanzi, for for thinking that my intervention here today could inspire such wonderful art. I'm touched.
Going.
So I mean, that's one way. That is one way that you could do it. Is you could say, look, as a matter of fact, you're required to be here, and if you're not here, then that's a criminal offense. I mean, another way that you could do it, Mr. Chair, would be to do it under the Elections Act. And if you did it under the Elections Act, particularly if the punishment for not showing up was some kind of fine, then you would actually be generating revenue. If we knew that a new process for federal election leaders debates was going to be revenue generating, then we would have to consider that as we consider this price tag of $750,000, because perhaps then the costs of both of developing and then implementing this new process would be offset by revenue. And we can imagine that federal leaders would be likely to want to show up and not incur that cost. But it would be an open question as to whether or not they do. And even as we think about that, another question comes up, which is which leaders of federal parties would be eligible or would be required under the legislation? Are they just leaders of official parties within the House of Commons prior to the last election? Would it be leaders of any registered political party that would then be part of this debate? Would it be leaders of federal political parties that are polling at a certain amount on the eve of the debate? I mean, I think there would be some considerable debate there about what the qualification is, and the reason that might have a cost implication, Mr. Chair, is simply because if we're looking at whether or not a fine structure would generate revenue, it's going to matter how many federal political party leaders are required to be at the debate. If there's a whole bunch of them that are required to be at the debate, it's more likely that this will be a revenue generating proposition than not. And of course, there's another question that comes up with respect to trying to forecast revenue and therefore what it's appropriate for Parliament to approve, which is if every leader of a federal political party is required to be at this debate. Of course, we know some parties have more resources than others, and there may be a number of small parties without the means to fund their leader getting to that debate, in which case they're going to have to undergo or submit to the fine, Mr. Chair. And so that is a question that bears on this. So that's just the most extreme, some of the most extreme versions where you have the government say, we're going to set the date, we're going to require that you be there either as a matter of criminal law, in which case we're amending the criminal code, or as a matter of kind of administrative requirement under the Elections Act, in which case there may be fines which could generate revenue, but you may also, and the government in Bill C-76, I want to say, on the Omnibus Election Reform Act, has actually used this mechanism for other, as a penalty for other measures. So in that act, the government has proposed that if political parties fail to live up to the privacy policy that they post on their website, that a potential outcome of that could be that the party is deregistered, which is pretty severe, but that's a consequence that's been put on the table by this government already. And so if they were inclined to use some of the mechanisms that they're already suggesting for certain important breaches of the election law, then we might see a scenario where if leaders of federal political parties don't show up to the federal election leaders debate, that the party itself ends up deregistered. I mean, again, quite extreme, but but certainly something that is within the realm of the possible. And I'd remind you, Mr. Chair, and the committee, of course, that the debate that we're having on this particular initiative is so wide-ranging because when we had the departmental officials here and we asked questions about what they wanted to do with the money, they left virtually every possibility open. They in no way restricted our thinking in terms of what they may or may not be doing with that money. And so that's why I think it's quite relevant to be exploring some of the possibilities of what they might ultimately come up with. Certainly if I can think of these things, and if we hear other suggestions from other members of the committee eventually, then it's by no means beyond the ability of government to contemplate these things as well. So that would be the issue if they were contemplating legislative changes in the most kind of basic and strict way. But another way that they might introduce legislative changes that would be relatively complex and I think actually require more funding, although, as I said, Mr. Chair, I think it would be important for them to make those legislative changes and then ask for the funding, which is another reason why I think we can in good conscience support this amendment and remove this money from Vote 40. One other kind of legislative change would be not to have government decide the dates of those election debates, but to actually constitute through legislation some kind of independent commission that would then be the organization that does that and does it in a way that's arm's length. You'll recall, Mr. Chair, that I think some of the complaints, and this was a kind of an important discussion in the last election, but some of these grievances certainly predated the last election. The last election wasn't the only time that they came up. Had to do with effectively a media consortium without any particular, mandate or authority deciding when and where these debates would take place, as well as how these debates would unfold. And so, obviously that's something that any new legislation establishing a commission would want to address. And of course, we don't know that it would because we don't have any proposed legislation. We don't even know if the government is really contemplating that legislation. It does say in the budget, and if somebody ever wanted to find the page, maybe I'll look for it as I speak, Mr. Speaker, because I think it would be beneficial. And I do have a tab here that does mention that. The problem is there's so many tabs. I was trying to identify programs where there was an issue with not having sufficient information about a budget item before providing approval, and the PCO is definitely in here because that was one of them.
Mr. Peterson?
In relation to your previous inquiry, I think if you canvass the table, there might be some consensus to suspend for question period.
I'd like to get unanimity, but if we don't have unanimity, we'll continue on. No unanimity, so we will continue.
Well, thank you for that intervention, Mr. Peterson. That allowed me to find the reference to the page that I was contemplating before. So if you look at the budget entry for a new process for federal election leaders debates, members of the committee will find this on page 186 of the budget document, the equality growth, a strong middle class. For those members of the committee that don't have their copy of the budget handy, I'll just read this into the record. Leaders debates play an essential role in Canada's federal elections by engaging Canadians in the election campaigns and helping to inform their voting decisions. Over the past 50 years, the way leaders debates have been negotiated have put at risk the structure and potential usefulness of leaders debates. The government proposes to provide $6 million over 2 years. So just by way of explanatory note there, Mr. Chair, what you see there is that with the government asking for only $750 million or $750,000 this year, they're anticipating quite a large expenditure next year. And that money would be used to support a new process that would ensure that federal leaders' debates are organized in the public interest and improve Canadians' knowledge of the parties, their leaders, and their policy positions. In the coming months, the Minister of Democratic Institutions will bring forward potential approaches to leaders' debates. The government may introduce legislation to implement the approach taken to establish the new process for leaders' debates. So you see there quite clearly, Mr. Chair, that legislative changes of some kind are being contemplated. It's just that we don't know, they don't commit to actually making any legislative changes. They're just, but they are clearly contemplating them. And we also hear that the Minister of Democratic Institutions will bring forward potential approaches. But again, so it's not clear if she's going to consult and then develop some approaches. At that point, does that just go to Parliament? Does it go back out to Canada? What's the nature of consultation? What's the cost of consultation? Or does she have some ready-made already that they're considering that they're just going to bring forward? And at that point, either we will that's interesting.
I find it quite interesting what you're saying.
Yeah, well, I do find it interesting that all of the Liberal members of the committee have just left.
They most certainly have, but that means is we do not have quorum. And that also means, accordingly, we are adjourned. I will be reconvening the meeting, if possible, after votes.
Okay.
And we'll see who shows up. But now, for the record, I'd like to make sure that we indicate in the minutes exactly who is left at the time of adjournment, Mr. Blakey, Mr. Kelly, Mr. McCauley, and myself. But since we do not have quorum, we are currently adjourned.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.